Some people have a strange experience they cannot explain. Before something happens, they already feel it coming. Not clearly, not with details, but with a quiet certainty that something is about to change. Sometimes it is small, like knowing a conversation will turn uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels heavier, like sensing that something will go wrong before there is any visible sign. And yet, most of the time, they cannot explain how they knew. There is no obvious clue, no clear reason, no conscious thinking process. Just a feeling that arrives before the event itself. This creates a strange contradiction. If the future has not happened yet, how can the brain respond to it in advance? And if it is not truly predicting the future, then what exactly is it doing instead? So why do some humans seem to predict the future? There are moments that feel almost too quiet to notice at first. A pause in a conversation that seems slightly longer than expected, a shift in tone that cannot yet be explained, a small hesitation before someone speaks again. In these moments, nothing has clearly happened, and yet something already feels different. The mind does not form a full thought. There is no sentence, no clear reasoning. Instead, there is a subtle change in the way attention settles, as if something has already begun to unfold just beyond what can be seen. Many people recognize this experience only after it passes. They look back and realize that, for a brief moment, they had sensed the direction of what was coming next. Not with certainty, not with detail, but with a quiet sense that the situation was moving toward a particular outcome. This feeling does not arrive as knowledge. It arrives as a shift. It may appear as a slight discomfort, or as a calm expectation, or even as a faint sense of familiarity, as if the present moment is already connected to something that has not yet fully occurred. What makes this experience difficult to understand is that it seems to move in the wrong direction. The event has not yet happened, and yet the body and mind begin to respond as if it already has. In everyday life, this might be as simple as knowing that a conversation is about to become tense before any words have been spoken to signal it. It might be the sense that a plan will not work out, even while everything still appears normal on the surface. These are not dramatic moments. They are quiet, often overlooked, and easy to dismiss. But they are also consistent enough that many people cannot ignore them completely. When this happens, the mind often searches for an explanation after the fact. It asks what clues were present, what signs were missed, what details might have led to that early feeling. And sometimes, there are clues that can be identified. A change in facial expression, a slight delay in response, a pattern that resembles something experienced before. But in many cases, these details are not consciously noticed at the time. They are processed somewhere below the level of deliberate thought. This is where the experience begins to feel unusual, because if the mind did not clearly register the signals, then what exactly created the feeling in the first place? To understand this, it is helpful to step away from the idea of prediction as something rare or special, and instead look at the conditions in which the human mind first developed. For most of human history, the environment did not present itself in clear, isolated events. It was continuous, uncertain, and often difficult to interpret in a direct way. Changes in sound, movement, or light could signal something important, but rarely in an obvious form. The ability to notice a pattern before it became clear may not have been a separate skill, but a gradual extension of how perception itself worked. Rather than waiting for complete information, the mind had to operate with fragments, with partial signals that hinted at what might come next. Over time, this created a system that does not simply react to what is fully visible, but that continuously adjusts to what is beginning to emerge. In this sense, the feeling of knowing before something happens may not be about seeing the future at all. It may be about responding to the present at a level that is not fully accessible to awareness. The moment before something happens is not empty. It is filled with small changes, subtle patterns, and incomplete signals that the mind is already processing. What appears to be a prediction may instead be the result of this ongoing process, where the brain is quietly aligning what it senses now with what it has learned over a very long time. And because this process unfolds without clear language or deliberate attention, it can feel as if it comes from somewhere else, as if it arrives before thought has had time to form. This is why the experience often remains difficult to explain. It does not follow the structure of conscious reasoning. It does not present itself as a clear cause and effect. It simply appears briefly as a sense that something is about to happen. Even while nothing has yet changed in any obvious way, the feeling often passes quickly, almost before it can be examined. It does not stay long enough to be turned into a clear thought, and it rarely demands attention in the way that stronger emotions do. Instead, it settles lightly, then fades as the situation continues to unfold. Only afterward, when the outcome becomes visible, does the earlier moment return to awareness. It is remembered not as a decision or a conclusion, but as something quieter, something that had no clear shape at the time. This is why it can feel as if the mind knew something in advance. The sequence appears reversed. First there was a feeling, and only later came the explanation. In ordinary thinking, this order is expected to move in the opposite direction. Information is gathered, patterns are recognized, and then a conclusion is formed. But in these moments, the conclusion seems to arrive without the steps that usually lead to it. This creates a gap in understanding, a space where the mind cannot easily trace how it moved from perception to anticipation. Within that gap, the experience begins to feel unusual, even slightly outside the normal way of thinking. Yet if we look more closely at how perception operates, this reversal may not be as unusual as it seems. The human mind does not wait for complete clarity before it begins to organize what it senses. It is constantly adjusting, even when attention is directed elsewhere. Sounds are grouped, movements are compared, and small variations are measured against what has been experienced before. These processes do not pause simply because the conscious mind is focused on something else. They continue in the background, shaping the way each moment is interpreted. This means that by the time something becomes noticeable, a large part of the processing has already taken place. The feeling that appears first may not be the beginning of the process, but the surface of something that has been developing quietly for some time. In environments where early humans lived, this kind of continuous adjustment may have been a natural part of perception rather than a separate ability. The world was not presented in clear signals that could be easily separated and analyzed. It changed gradually, often in ways that were difficult to isolate into single causes. A shift in wind, a change in the behavior of animals, or a slight difference in light could all carry meaning, but only when considered together. Under these conditions, waiting for certainty before responding would have been less useful than allowing small changes to accumulate into a general sense of direction. Over long periods, this may have shaped a way of perceiving that favors early alignment over delayed confirmation. The mind does not wait to be sure. It begins to lean toward an outcome as soon as enough subtle signals are present, even if those signals are not strong enough to form a clear idea. This leaning is not expressed as a statement. It does not appear as a defined prediction. It appears as a shift in expectation, a slight change in how the present moment is held. Because this process unfolds without clear language, it can be difficult to notice while it is happening. It does not announce itself. It does not explain where it comes from. It simply influences the way attention moves, the way the body responds, and the way possibilities begin to narrow without being consciously named. When the outcome later confirms this early alignment, the mind looks back and tries to reconstruct the path that led there. But much of that path was never fully visible to begin with. It existed in small adjustments, in patterns too faint to be held in conscious awareness, and in comparisons drawn from past experience that were never clearly expressed. This is why the experience can feel like knowing without knowing how. It is not that the mind reached forward into the future. It is that it responded to the present in a way that was already oriented toward what was about to happen. And because that orientation formed quietly, without clear steps or deliberate reasoning, it leaves behind a sense of mystery that is not easily resolved by simply looking for a single cause. There is another detail that often goes unnoticed in these moments. The feeling does not arrive with certainty. It is not firm or precise, and it does not demand to be believed. In many cases, it is so light that it can be ignored without consequence. A person may sense that something is about to change, and yet continue as if nothing is different. Only later, when the change becomes clear, does that earlier impression gain meaning. This is important, because it shows that the experience is not built on certainty, but on probability. It does not declare what will happen. It suggests a direction, a tendency, a possible outcome that has begun to form but has not yet fully appeared. In this way, the mind is not making a statement about the future. It is adjusting to what is already unfolding in the present, even if that unfolding is still too subtle to be clearly seen. This adjustment can be understood more easily when we consider how the brain organizes incomplete information. At any given moment, the senses provide far more detail than can be consciously processed. Much of this information is filtered, simplified, or combined before it reaches awareness. This means that the experience of the present is already the result of a selection process, shaped by what the brain considers relevant. Within that process, small patterns can begin to take form long before they become obvious. A slight change in posture, a difference in timing, or a familiar arrangement of events can all contribute to a growing sense that something is moving in a particular direction. These elements are not strong enough on their own to produce a clear conclusion, but together, they can create a shift in expectation that feels like a quiet form of knowing. If we return again to the conditions in which human perception developed, this kind of early adjustment becomes easier to understand. In a world where clear signals were rare, the ability to work with partial information would have been a natural part of survival. The mind could not depend on complete evidence before it responded. It had to remain open to small changes, to incomplete patterns, and to signals that only made sense when combined with past experience. Over time, this may have shaped a way of perceiving that does not wait for full clarity, but instead moves gradually toward what is most likely to occur. This movement is not conscious. It does not appear as a deliberate act of reasoning. It happens quietly, beneath the level of awareness, as the brain continuously compares what is happening now with what has happened before. When enough of these comparisons begin to align, a feeling emerges. It is not exact, and it is not fully formed, but it carries a direction. This direction is what gives the impression of anticipation. It is not a vision of the future, but a response to the present that has already begun to organize itself around what is likely to come next. Because this process is subtle, it often goes unnoticed in real time. The mind does not stop to examine it, and the body does not treat it as something urgent. It remains in the background, influencing perception without drawing attention to itself. Only when the outcome becomes visible does the earlier moment return, now connected to a clear result. This connection creates the impression that the feeling came first, and that it somehow reached beyond what was available at the time. But in reality, the feeling may have been shaped entirely by what was already present, just not yet fully recognized. This is why the experience can feel both familiar and difficult to explain. It is familiar because it arises from ordinary processes that are always at work. It is difficult to explain because those processes do not present themselves in a clear or structured way. They do not form a sequence that can be easily described. They remain distributed, subtle, and largely hidden from conscious awareness. And so, the moment before something happens continues to feel unusual, not because it lies outside the normal functioning of the mind, but because it reveals a part of that functioning that is rarely seen directly, a part that operates quietly, continuously, and without needing to be understood in order to shape what comes next. At first glance, it may seem as if the mind simply reacts to what is already there. A sound is heard, a movement is seen, and then a response follows. This sequence feels natural, almost automatic, and it gives the impression that perception begins with the present moment. But if we slow this process down, a different pattern begins to appear. The mind does not wait passively for events to complete themselves before it begins to respond. Instead, it is already preparing, already adjusting, already leaning toward what it expects to happen next. This can be difficult to notice because the process is continuous. There is no clear starting point where perception begins and prediction follows. They unfold together, quietly, without separation. In everyday experience, this becomes visible in small ways. When listening to someone speak, the mind often anticipates the next word before it is said. When walking through a familiar place, the body adjusts its movement before obstacles are fully seen. Even in simple actions, such as reaching for an object, the hand begins to shape itself in advance, aligning with what it expects to encounter. These are not deliberate predictions. They are not conscious decisions. They are part of how perception itself is organized. The mind does not build an image of the world and then react to it. It continuously refines that image as it moves forward, guided by what it has learned from previous experience. This suggests that the feeling of knowing before something happens may not be an exception to how the mind works, but a clearer expression of its normal state. The brain is not designed to wait for certainty. It is structured to move ahead of the present, to prepare for what is likely rather than respond only to what is already complete. If we consider the conditions in which this structure developed, the reason becomes more understandable. For much of human history, environments were not stable or predictable in a simple way. They changed gradually, often without clear boundaries between one state and the next. A situation rarely presented itself as a finished event. Instead, it unfolded over time, with early signs that could be noticed before the outcome became obvious. In such conditions, the ability to adjust early may have been closely tied to the way perception itself operated. The mind would not separate sensing from anticipating. It would combine them into a single, continuous process. This process can be thought of as a constant negotiation between what is currently sensed and what is expected to follow. Each moment is not taken as complete in itself. It is interpreted as part of an ongoing sequence, where the present is always connected to what has just occurred and what is about to occur. Because of this, perception is never entirely fixed. It is always slightly ahead, slightly shaped by expectation, even before that expectation becomes visible to awareness. This is why certain experiences can feel as if they arrive before their cause. The mind has already begun to align with a possible outcome, based on patterns that are still forming. By the time the outcome becomes clear, the adjustment has already taken place. From the outside, it appears as if the mind predicted what would happen. But from within the process itself, there was no single moment of prediction. There was only a continuous movement toward what seemed most likely, guided by patterns that were already present but not yet fully defined. This movement does not require conscious effort. It does not depend on deliberate reasoning or explicit knowledge. It operates quietly as part of the basic organization of perception, and because it is always active, it is often invisible. It does not stand out as something unusual, except in moments when its effects become noticeable. When a person feels that something is about to happen before it does, they are not stepping outside the normal function of the mind. They are encountering it more directly, in a way that reveals how perception is always slightly ahead of itself, always shaped by what it expects, even when that expectation has not yet taken form as a clear thought. If the mind is always slightly ahead of what is happening, then the present moment is never experienced as something entirely new. It is already shaped by what the brain expects to find. This expectation is not a fixed idea or a clear image. It is more like a quiet framework, a set of possibilities that guide how incoming information is interpreted. When the senses provide new details, they are not received in isolation. They are compared, adjusted, and fitted into this ongoing framework almost immediately. Because of this, perception is not simply a record of what is out there. It is a process of matching what is sensed with what is anticipated, where each moment is influenced by both directions at once. This can be seen in the way small inconsistencies stand out more than perfect matches. When something unfolds exactly as expected, it often passes without notice. But when there is a slight difference, even a subtle one, attention shifts toward it. This suggests that the mind is not only taking in information but also continuously checking whether that information aligns with its expectations. When there is alignment, the process remains quiet. When there is a difference, the mind becomes more active, adjusting its expectations and updating its sense of what is happening. In this way, perception can be understood as a balance between confirmation and correction. The brain is always proposing a version of what is about to occur, and then testing that proposal against what actually unfolds. When the two are close enough, the experience feels smooth and continuous. When they diverge, even slightly, a feeling may emerge before any clear thought forms. This feeling can be subtle, but it carries information. It reflects a difference between what was expected and what is beginning to happen. This is where the sense of anticipation can begin to take shape. It is not that the mind has reached into the future, it is that it has detected a shift in the present, a small movement away from what it had prepared for. Because this detection happens quickly, often before conscious awareness, it can appear as if the feeling came first, before any reason could be identified. But in reality, it is part of a continuous process where expectation and perception are always interacting. If we look again at the conditions under which human perception developed, this process becomes more understandable. Environments were rarely stable enough to allow for complete certainty. Conditions changed gradually, and important events were often preceded by subtle signs. A difference in sound, a change in rhythm, or a slight alteration in movement could all signal that something was about to happen. These signals were not always clear or isolated. They were part of a larger pattern that had to be interpreted over time. In such conditions, the ability to notice small mismatches between expectation and reality may have been an essential part of how perception functioned. The mind could not rely on clear, separate signals. It had to remain sensitive to small deviations, using them to adjust its understanding of what was unfolding. This sensitivity did not need to be conscious. It could operate quietly, guiding attention and shaping responses without requiring explicit reasoning. Over long periods, this may have contributed to a system where the detection of change occurs early before it becomes obvious. The feeling that something is about to happen may arise from this early detection, where the brain recognizes a pattern that is beginning to shift, even if that pattern has not yet formed a clear image. This also explains why the experience is often vague. The signals that create it are incomplete. They do not point to a single, definite outcome. They suggest a direction, a possibility that is becoming more likely, but not yet certain. Because of this, the feeling remains open, without clear boundaries or precise content. It is a reflection of a process that is still unfolding, where the mind is adjusting to what is emerging rather than declaring what will happen. And because this adjustment takes place before conscious thought, it can feel as if it appears suddenly, without a visible cause. But it is not sudden. It is the surface of a continuous process, one that is always active, always comparing, always preparing, even when it is not noticed at all. When this ongoing process is considered over a longer span of time, it becomes clear that the mind is not only adjusting from moment to moment, it is also carrying forward traces of previous situations, allowing them to shape how new experiences are approached. These traces are not always clear memories. They are often fragments, patterns of timing, sequences of events, or subtle relationships between actions and outcomes. The brain does not store every detail in a precise form. Instead, it retains what was useful for understanding how situations tend to unfold. Over time, these retained patterns begin to influence how the present is interpreted, even when the connection is not consciously recognized. This means that what feels like an immediate reaction is often the result of many past experiences quietly informing the present. When a situation begins to resemble something that has happened before, even in a partial way, the brain starts to align itself with what it has learned from those earlier moments. This alignment does not require a clear memory to be recalled. It can occur through small adjustments in attention, expectation, and bodily response, all of which take place without deliberate awareness. Because of this, the feeling that something is about to happen can emerge without a clear reference point. The mind does not present the past experience that shaped the expectation. It only reflects its influence through a shift in how the present moment is held. If we return to the environments in which early human perception developed, this way of processing becomes easier to understand. Life unfolded in continuous sequences rather than isolated events. A single moment rarely stood alone. It was part of a chain, where each change was connected to what came before and what might follow. In such conditions, recognizing the beginning of a familiar sequence could be more useful than waiting for the full pattern to appear. The mind did not need to identify every element with precision. It needed to sense when a situation was starting to move in a known direction. Over time, this may have shaped a system that favors early alignment with patterns, rather than complete analysis of each individual detail. The brain does not need to know exactly what is happening in order to begin adjusting to it. It only needs enough similarity to past experience to guide its expectations. This can be seen in how quickly the mind responds to partial information. A few elements are enough to suggest a possible outcome, and the brain begins to prepare for that outcome even before it is confirmed. This preparation is not always visible. It may appear as a slight change in attention, a subtle shift in posture, or a quiet sense that something is different. These changes are small, but they reflect a deeper process where the present is being interpreted through the lens of accumulated experience. When the situation continues and the outcome becomes clearer, the earlier adjustment may seem accurate, as if the mind had known in advance what would happen. But in reality, it was responding to the early stages of a pattern that had already begun to form. This also helps explain why the experience can vary from one moment to another. Sometimes the alignment between past patterns and present signals is strong, and the feeling appears more clearly. At other times, the signals are weaker or less familiar, and the sense of anticipation is less noticeable or even absent. The process itself does not change, but the conditions that shape it do. The mind is always comparing, always aligning, but the clarity of the result depends on how closely the present resembles what has been learned before. In this way, the sense of knowing before something happens is not a separate ability that appears only in certain moments. It is an expression of how the brain continuously integrates past and present. It reflects a system that is designed to move through time by linking what has already been experienced with what is currently unfolding. And because this linking happens quietly, without requiring conscious recognition of its sources, it can feel as if the mind has arrived at an answer without showing the path that led there. If the mind is always adjusting slightly ahead of what is happening, then this tendency must have developed under conditions where waiting was not always possible. There were environments in which signals did not arrive in clear, separate forms, and where important changes often began long before they could be fully recognized. In such settings, responding only after something became obvious may have been less useful than responding while it was still unfolding. This does not mean that early humans consciously predicted events in the way we might imagine today. It suggests something quieter. Their perception may have been shaped by a constant need to work with incomplete information, where small differences could carry meaning even if they were not fully understood at the time. A shift in sound, a break in a familiar pattern, or a subtle change in movement could all signal that something was beginning to change. These signals were rarely clear on their own. They became meaningful only when placed within a broader context, one that was built from repeated experience over time. Because of this, perception may have been less about identifying isolated events, and more about sensing how situations were moving. The mind did not need to wait for certainty. It needed to remain sensitive to direction, to the way a sequence was beginning to form even before it reached a clear outcome. Over many generations, this kind of sensitivity could have become part of how perception itself was organized. The brain did not separate sensing from anticipating. It treated them as part of the same process, where each moment was understood not only by what was present, but also by what it suggested about what might follow. This does not require a dramatic or specific explanation. It can be understood as a gradual alignment between perception and the conditions in which it operated. In environments where change was continuous and signals were often incomplete, the ability to respond early may have been closely tied to how perception developed. The mind would not have needed to form clear predictions in a conscious sense. It would have adjusted quietly, guided by patterns that had been encountered before, even if those patterns were only partially visible. This way of processing does not produce certainty. It produces a sense of direction, a leaning toward what seems most likely based on the information available at the time. When this leaning aligns with what eventually happens, it can appear as if the mind had anticipated the future. But the process itself does not involve reaching forward into time. It remains grounded in the present, shaped by signals that are already there but not yet fully recognized. If we consider how this might appear in daily life, the connection becomes clearer. A person may sense that a situation is about to change before any obvious sign appears. This feeling does not come from a single detail. It arises from many small elements that are being processed together. None of them are strong enough to stand out on their own, but together they begin to form a pattern. The mind responds to this pattern as it emerges, not as a finished event, but as something that is in the process of becoming. This response is subtle. It does not interrupt the flow of experience. It does not require attention or explanation. It remains in the background, influencing how the present moment is understood without announcing itself directly. Only later, when the change becomes clear, does the earlier adjustment gain significance. At that point, the sequence appears to move backward. The feeling is remembered first, followed by the event that seemed to confirm it. This creates the impression that the mind had moved ahead of time, that it had known something before it happened. But if we look closely, the process never left the present. It responded to what was already unfolding, guided by patterns that were just beginning to take shape. This perspective does not remove the sense of mystery entirely, but it shifts where that mystery lies. It is no longer about how the mind could access something that has not yet occurred. It is about how the mind can respond so quickly to what is already in motion, even when that motion is still too subtle to be clearly seen. And this brings the focus back to the conditions under which such a system might have developed, where sensitivity to early change was not separate from perception, but woven into it from the beginning. In environments where change unfolded gradually, the difference between what was already present and what was about to happen was often very small. A situation did not begin with a clear signal and then move toward an obvious outcome. It shifted slowly, with early signs that were easy to overlook if attention remained fixed on what was already known. Under these conditions, perception may have depended less on identifying complete events and more on remaining open to partial changes that suggested a direction. The mind did not need to be certain. It needed to stay responsive to small movements within the environment, even when those movements did not yet form a clear pattern. This kind of responsiveness does not require conscious effort. It can emerge as part of how attention is distributed, where the brain remains sensitive to variation without needing to isolate a single cause. If a sequence of events began to diverge from what was familiar, even slightly, the mind could begin to adjust before the divergence became obvious. This adjustment would not appear as a clear decision. It would be felt as a subtle shift, a quiet sense that something was no longer unfolding in the expected way. In many cases, this sense would not lead to any immediate action. It would simply remain present, influencing how the situation was perceived as it continued. Over time, such early adjustments may have accumulated into a broader way of experiencing the world, where perception itself was shaped by a continuous awareness of change, rather than by isolated moments of clarity. If we consider how this might connect to the experience of knowing before something happens, the link becomes more direct. The feeling does not emerge from a single, strong signal. It arises from a collection of small differences that, when taken together, begin to suggest a shift. Each difference on its own may be too weak to notice, but the mind does not process them in isolation. It combines them, compares them to previous patterns, and gradually forms an expectation about where the situation is heading. This expectation is not precise. It does not define exactly what will occur. It simply narrows the range of possibilities, making some outcomes feel more likely than others. Because this narrowing happens before a clear outcome appears, it can be experienced as a kind of anticipation that has no visible source. The present moment feels as though it is already connected to something that has not yet fully arrived. This connection is not based on certainty, it is based on probability, on the way multiple small signals begin to align with patterns that have been encountered before. In this sense, the mind is not reaching beyond the present. It is deepening its response to it, drawing on past experience to interpret what is beginning to form. This process may have been especially relevant in conditions where important changes did not announce themselves clearly. A gradual shift in sound or movement could indicate that something was approaching, but only if it was recognized early enough. Waiting for a clear sign might have meant responding too late, while responding too early carried its own cost. The balance between these two possibilities may have shaped a system that favors early, flexible adjustment rather than delayed certainty. The mind does not commit fully to a single outcome. It leans toward possibilities, ready to adjust again as more information becomes available. This flexibility allows perception to remain open while still providing a sense of direction. It also explains why the feeling of knowing before something happens is often incomplete. It does not arrive with full clarity because it is formed at a stage where the situation itself is not yet clear. It reflects an early alignment with a pattern that is still developing, one that may continue to change as new information emerges. When the outcome later becomes visible, the earlier feeling may appear accurate, as if it had anticipated the event. But in reality, it was part of a continuous process of adjustment, one that never left the present, but that remained closely connected to what was beginning to unfold within it. In conditions where small changes could matter, the difference between responding early and responding late was often measured not in clear outcomes, but in how smoothly a situation could be navigated. The environment did not always present clear dangers or clear opportunities. Instead, it offered gradual transitions, where a sequence might begin to shift long before it reached a point that demanded attention. Within such conditions, the the mind did not need to form exact conclusions. It needed to remain adaptable, able to adjust its expectations as soon as a pattern began to move in a different direction. This adaptability does not depend on certainty. It depends on sensitivity to change, even when that change is incomplete. If the mind had waited for full clarity, many of these transitions would have already passed their most important stage. By the time a situation became obvious, the opportunity to respond smoothly might already have been reduced. Because of this, perception may have developed as a process that favors early alignment over delayed confirmation. The brain does not commit to a fixed interpretation too quickly, but it does begin to shift its orientation as soon as enough signals suggest that a change is underway. This shift is not dramatic. It does not interrupt ongoing activity or demand conscious analysis. It remains subtle, guiding attention in small ways, influencing how incoming information is organized and preparing the body for a range of possible outcomes. In many cases, this preparation may not lead to any visible action. It simply creates a readiness, a slight adjustment in how the present moment is held. This readiness is difficult to describe because it does not take the form of a clear thought. It does not explain itself. It does not present reasons or evidence. It exists as a quiet change in the background, shaping perception without drawing attention to its own source. When a situation continues and the change becomes more visible, this earlier adjustment may appear to have anticipated what was about to happen. But the process itself did not involve a clear act of prediction. It was part of a continuous effort to remain aligned with what was unfolding, even when that unfolding had not yet reached a clear form. If we consider how this relates to the experience of knowing before something happens, the connection becomes more grounded. The feeling is not a sudden insight that appears without cause. It is the result of many small adjustments that have already taken place, each one too subtle to notice on its own. These adjustments accumulate, gradually shaping a sense of direction that can be felt even before it can be explained. Because this accumulation happens without conscious awareness, it can feel as if the mind has arrived at a conclusion without showing the steps that led there. This absence of visible steps is what gives the experience its unusual quality. It appears to bypass the normal process of reasoning, creating the impression that the answer came first and the explanation followed later. But in reality, the process did not bypass anything. It simply unfolded in a way that did not require conscious attention. It remained distributed across many small signals, each one contributing to a larger pattern that was still forming. This also helps explain why the feeling can be inconsistent. Sometimes the signals align clearly, and the sense of anticipation is stronger. At other times, the signals are less coherent, and the feeling is weaker or absent altogether. The underlying process remains the same, but the clarity of its result depends on how well the present situation matches patterns that have been encountered before. When there is a strong match, the mind can align more quickly, and the feeling becomes more noticeable. When the match is weaker, the process continues quietly, without producing a clear sense of direction. In this way, the experience of knowing before something happens reflects a balance between sensitivity and uncertainty. The mind remains open to change, adjusting early when possible, but without committing fully until more information becomes available. It does not reach beyond the present. It stays within it, responding to what is already beginning to take shape, even when that shape is still too faint to be clearly seen. Most of what the mind notices never becomes a thought. It remains below the level of language, below the point where a person could stop and say exactly what has been seen or why it matters. A face changes very slightly. A familiar rhythm becomes uneven. The timing of a reply shifts by only a fraction. None of these details seem important on their own, and often they are not consciously registered at all. Yet the brain does not wait for conscious attention before it begins working with them. It continues sorting, comparing, and measuring small differences, even when the person experiencing them would insist that nothing unusual has been noticed. This is one reason the feeling of knowing before something happens can seem so difficult to explain. The pattern was detected, but it was detected without being named. In ordinary life, people often imagine that recognition begins only when something becomes clear enough to describe, but recognition can begin much earlier than that. The mind is capable of responding to relationships between details long before those details become available to deliberate thought. A person may not notice a single expression, tone, or movement in isolation, yet still respond to the overall pattern they create when combined. This is important because the sense of anticipation does not usually come from one strong clue. It comes from many small clues that are too weak to stand out alone, but that begin to point in the same direction when gathered together. In that sense, what feels mysterious may actually depend on something very ordinary. The brain is often better at detecting patterns than the conscious mind is at explaining them. If we look back toward the older conditions in which human perception took shape, this becomes easier to understand. The world in which early humans lived would not always have offered clear, isolated signals. Much of what mattered may have appeared gradually, through partial changes in sound, motion, spacing, or repetition. Perception under such conditions may have depended less on certainty and more on sensitivity to arrangement. The mind did not need to identify each signal separately before responding. It only needed to detect that the pattern as a whole had shifted enough to deserve attention. Over time, this could support a form of recognition that remains largely hidden from awareness, where the brain notices structure before the person can say what has changed. This hidden recognition may help explain why some situations feel familiar before they are understood. The person is not remembering a single event in a clear way. Instead, the brain may be responding to a resemblance in form, in sequence, or in the way several small details fit together. Because this resemblance is partial, the response is also partial. It does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as a feeling, a slight tension, a quiet expectation, or a sense that something is no longer moving in the usual way. What is being detected is not a complete outcome, but the beginning of a pattern that resembles something encountered before. And because that resemblance is registered without language, the feeling appears before the explanation. This is why conscious thought often comes too late to account for the experience. By the time a person starts searching for reasons, the deeper comparison has already happened. The brain has already placed the present moment against a vast background of earlier patterns and has already begun to shift its expectations accordingly. None of this means the mind is infallible. Hidden pattern detection can lean in the wrong direction, especially when fragments are mistaken for stronger similarities than they really are. But even when it is imperfect, it shows that the feeling of knowing before something happens may arise not from seeing beyond the present, but from noticing more within it than consciousness can easily hold at once. The future is not being revealed. The present is being read at a depth that thought can feel, but cannot immediately describe. When patterns are detected without entering awareness, they do not appear as clear objects of thought. They are not held in language, and they do not remain long enough to be examined directly. Instead, they influence the direction of attention, shaping what feels stable and what feels slightly unsettled. A person may not be able to point to any single detail that has changed, yet still experience a shift in how the situation is understood. This shift is often quiet, almost indistinguishable from the normal flow of perception, but it carries information. It reflects a difference between what the mind had prepared for and what is beginning to unfold. Because this difference is distributed across many small elements, it does not gather into a single clear signal. It remains diffuse, affecting the overall sense of the moment rather than presenting itself as a specific observation. This is why the feeling of anticipation often lacks detail. It does not come with images or explanations. It comes as a general orientation, a sense that the situation is moving in a direction that has not yet been fully revealed. The mind does not wait for this direction to become obvious. It begins to respond to it as soon as enough partial signals align. These signals may include slight variations in timing, small inconsistencies in behavior, or subtle changes in the arrangement of elements within the environment. Each of these variations may be too weak to notice on its own, but when they occur together, they can shift the overall pattern enough for the brain to register a difference. This registration does not require conscious attention. It can take place as part of the continuous background activity of perception, where the brain is always comparing what is happening now with what it has encountered before. If we consider the environments in which such processes may have developed, the usefulness of this kind of sensitivity becomes more apparent. In settings where clear signals were rare, the ability to detect small changes across multiple elements could provide an early indication that something was beginning to shift. This indication would not be precise. It would not identify a specific cause or outcome, but it could guide attention, allowing the mind to become more alert to a situation that was no longer unfolding in a familiar way. Over time, this may have supported a form of perception that does not depend on isolated cues, but on the integration of many small differences. The mind does not need to identify each change separately. It responds to the pattern they create when combined. This combined response is what gives rise to the feeling that something is about to happen, even when no single element stands out as a clear sign. Because this process operates without clear boundaries, it can be difficult to trace. A person may try to recall what led to the feeling, searching for specific details that could explain it. But those details were never isolated in the first place. They were part of a distributed pattern, one that influenced perception without forming a distinct memory. This is why the explanation often feels incomplete. The mind is attempting to describe something that did not occur as a single identifiable event. Instead, it unfolded across many small signals, each one contributing to a larger shift that was felt rather than clearly seen. This also helps explain why the experience can feel both familiar and uncertain at the same time. It is familiar because it arises from processes that are always active. It is uncertain because those processes do not produce clear, stable representations. They operate in gradients, in tendencies, and in probabilities, rather than in fixed conclusions. The feeling that results from this activity reflects that uncertainty. It points toward a possible direction without defining it completely. When the outcome later confirms this direction, the earlier feeling appears meaningful, as if it had anticipated what was to come. But the anticipation was not a separate act. It was part of a continuous adjustment, where the mind was already responding to changes that had begun to take shape, even if those changes had not yet reached the level of conscious recognition. The more quietly a pattern is detected, the more strange it can seem when it later proves meaningful. This is because the conscious mind tends to trust what it can clearly identify. It prefers single causes, visible clues, and reasons that can be named in sequence. But much of perception does not operate in that way. It does not wait for one decisive sign. It moves through layers of small relations, comparing what is happening now with countless earlier arrangements that were never stored as full stories. A certain spacing between words, a familiar hesitation, a slight mismatch between expression and tone, or a change in the pace of events may not seem important when taken separately. Yet together, they can create a structure the brain recognizes before awareness has time to describe it. This helps explain why a person may later say that they felt something coming, while still being unable to explain how. The explanation is difficult not because nothing was there, but because what was there existed as a pattern rather than a single fact. In older human environments, this may have mattered more than modern thought usually assumes. Life did not always present itself in clean categories. Important changes may have begun through weak signals spread across space and time, not through one clear event. A disturbance could begin as a slight break in repetition, a change in the arrangement of movement, or a subtle difference in how several things related to one another. Under such conditions, the mind would not benefit most from waiting until one signal became undeniable. It would benefit from remaining sensitive to combinations, to the way many faint elements could begin leaning in the same direction before any of them became obvious alone. This kind of hidden pattern detection may be one reason anticipation so often feels bodily before it feels verbal. The brain has already begun adjusting, but language has not caught up. What appears first is not a full idea. It is a shift in readiness, a quiet alteration in expectation, as if attention has already turned towards something that has not yet fully entered view. Because this response forms below the level of clear thought, it can feel detached from reasoning itself. A person may search for the cause and find nothing definite, but the absence of a definite cause does not mean the feeling came from nowhere. It may simply mean that the cause was distributed across many small cues, each too weak to be consciously noticed, yet strong enough in combination to influence perception. This also reveals why the experience is often only partly accurate. Patterns are rarely exact copies of one another. The mind works with resemblance, not certainty. It detects structure, not prophecy. Sometimes that structure continues in the direction the brain has begun to expect, and the feeling seems almost uncannily correct. At other times, the resemblance is incomplete, and the expectation drifts away from what actually happens. What remains important is not whether the mind can perfectly foresee outcomes, but that it is continuously organizing the present through hidden comparisons that thought does not fully witness. In that sense, the strange feeling of knowing before something happens may be one of the few moments when ordinary perception briefly reveals its deeper method. The mind is not suddenly becoming magical. It is exposing a quiet truth about itself. It is always reading more than consciousness can hold at once, always assembling relationships beneath language, and always preparing for what seems likely before the person experiencing it knows how to say why. When people think about memory, they often imagine it as a way of holding the past in place. Events are stored, recalled, and then compared with what is happening now. This view makes memory seem like something that looks backward, something that retrieves what has already happened. But the way memory functions within the mind is not limited to recalling finished events. It is closely tied to how the present is interpreted, and even more quietly, to how the next moment is anticipated. Memory does not only preserve what was, it also shapes what is expected to follow. This becomes easier to notice in simple situations. When a person hears the beginning of a familiar phrase, the rest of the phrase often comes to mind before it is spoken. When walking along a well-known path, the body adjusts its movement in advance, turning slightly before the corner is fully seen. These are not deliberate acts of recall. The person is not consciously retrieving a past event and applying it step by step. Instead, the past is already woven into the way the present is experienced. The mind does not separate memory from perception. It allows previous experience to guide what feels likely, even when that guidance remains below awareness. In this sense, memory acts less like a record and more like a quiet set of expectations. It does not need to present a full image of the past in order to influence the present. It only needs to provide enough structure for the brain to recognize a pattern and begin adjusting accordingly. This is important for understanding why the feeling of knowing before something happens can appear without a clear source. The influence of memory is present, but it is not expressed as a specific recollection. It is expressed as a shift in expectation, a subtle alignment with what has been encountered before, even if the person cannot identify when or where that encounter took place. If we consider how this might have developed over long periods of human history, the role of memory becomes even more central. The environments in which people lived were not static. They changed across seasons, across locations, and across repeated encounters with similar situations. Learning from these changes would not always depend on recalling exact events. It would depend on recognizing recurring structures, on sensing how certain arrangements tended to unfold over time. Memory, in this context, would not need to store every detail. It would need to retain patterns, tendencies, and relationships that could be applied flexibly to new situations. This kind of memory does not produce clear images. It produces readiness. It allows the mind to move slightly ahead of the present, guided by what has been learned through repetition, even when that learning is not consciously accessible. The feeling that something is about to happen may arise from this readiness. The brain is not retrieving a specific past event and declaring that it will repeat. It is aligning the present with a pattern that has occurred before and preparing for a similar direction to unfold. Because this alignment happens without clear recall, it can feel as if it appears on its own, without a visible cause. The past is present, but not in a form that can be easily named. This also explains why the feeling often carries no detail. It does not specify exactly what will happen. It does not describe the outcome. It simply narrows the range of possibilities, making certain directions feel more likely than others. This narrowing is enough to create a sense of anticipation, even if the mind cannot explain it. The future is not being predicted in a precise way. It is being shaped by the past in a way that is continuous and often hidden. And because this shaping occurs before conscious thought has time to organize it into language, it can feel as if the mind has reached an answer before it has been asked a question. What memory retains is often less precise than it appears. It does not preserve every detail of an event in a fixed and complete form. Instead, it tends to hold on to relationships, sequences, and the general shape of how things unfolded. Over time, these retained patterns become more important than the exact events themselves. The mind does not need to recall a situation perfectly in order to use it. It only needs to recognize enough similarity to guide its expectations in the present. This means that memory is not simply replayed when it is used. It is reshaped, adjusted, and combined with current input to form something that fits the moment. Because of this, the influence of memory is often indirect. It does not appear as a clear recollection, it appears as a tendency, a leaning towards certain interpretations rather than others. When a situation begins to resemble something encountered before, even in a partial way, the brain does not wait to confirm the match. It begins to adjust immediately, allowing that resemblance to influence how the present is understood. This adjustment can be very subtle. It may not produce a clear thought or a distinct image. Instead, it can shift the tone of the experience, making one outcome feel slightly more likely than another without explaining why. This is one of the reasons the feeling of knowing before something happens often lacks clarity. The memory that contributes to it is not being recalled in full. It is being used in fragments, in the form of patterns that guide perception without being fully revealed. If we return to the conditions in which human memory developed, this kind of flexibility becomes more understandable. The environments people moved through were not identical from one moment to the next, but they often shared underlying structures. A situation might not repeat exactly, but certain elements would appear again in different combinations. Under these conditions, storing exact details may have been less useful than retaining general patterns that could be applied across many variations. Memory, in this sense, would function less like a precise archive and more like a system for detecting similarity. It would allow the mind to recognize when something in the present resembles something from the past, even if the resemblance is incomplete. This recognition would not need to be conscious in order to be effective. It could guide attention and expectation quietly, influencing how new information is processed without requiring explicit recall. Over time, this may have shaped a way of using memory that prioritizes adaptability over accuracy, allowing the mind to respond quickly to situations that are similar but not identical to those encountered before. When this process is active, the present moment is not experienced on its own. It is filtered through layers of past experience, each one contributing to a general sense of what is likely to happen next. Because these layers are not clearly separated, they do not appear as individual memories. They merge into a single influence, shaping perception without announcing their presence. This is why the resulting feeling can seem to come from nowhere. The source is there, but it is distributed across many small traces that do not stand out on their own. Together, they create a shift in expectation that can be felt before it can be explained. This also helps explain why different people may experience this process in different ways. The patterns that memory retains depend on what has been encountered over time. Two people may face the same situation, but their past experiences may lead them to notice different similarities and form different expectations. The process itself remains the same, but the content that shapes it varies. In this way, the feeling of anticipation reflects not only the present situation, but also the accumulated history that each person carries, even when that history is not consciously recalled. When memory is understood in this way, as something that shapes expectation rather than simply preserving the past, the feeling of knowing before something happens begins to appear less isolated. It becomes part of a larger process in which the present is always being guided by what has been experienced before. This guidance does not require a clear act of recall. It does not depend on bringing a past event into awareness and comparing it step by step with what is happening now. Instead, it operates through a quiet alignment, where fragments of previous experience influence how the current moment is interpreted without being directly observed. This alignment can be seen in how quickly the mind responds to partial information. A situation does not need to match a past event exactly in order to feel familiar. It only needs to share enough structure for the brain to recognize a pattern and begin adjusting its expectations. This recognition can happen very early, before the situation has fully developed and before there is enough information to form a clear explanation. Because of this, the resulting feeling often appears incomplete. It does not describe what will happen. It suggests a direction, a possibility that is becoming more likely based on how similar patterns have unfolded in the past. The mind does not commit fully to that possibility. It remains flexible, ready to adjust again as new information appears. But even this partial alignment is enough to create a sense that something is about to happen, even if the reason for that sense cannot be clearly identified. If we consider how this process might have been useful over long periods of human history, its value becomes more visible. Environments did not repeat in exact forms, but they often contained recurring structures. A sequence of events might follow a familiar path, even if the details were different each time. Under these conditions, memory that could recognize general patterns rather than exact repetitions would allow the mind to respond earlier, before the full sequence had unfolded. This early response would not need to be precise. It would only need to provide enough direction for attention and behavior to begin adjusting. Over time, this may have supported a system where perception and memory are closely intertwined, where the present is continuously shaped by the past in a way that is both flexible and often hidden from awareness. This also helps explain why the experience of knowing before something happens often feels detached from conscious reasoning. The reasoning is there, but it does not appear in a form that can be easily followed. It is distributed across many small comparisons, each one contributing to a larger pattern that is recognized without being fully described. When the outcome later confirms this pattern, the earlier feeling may seem accurate, as if the mind had anticipated what would happen. But the anticipation was not a separate act. It was the result of memory quietly shaping expectation, guiding the interpretation of the present without presenting its source. Because this process unfolds continuously, it does not stand out as something unusual most of the time. It becomes noticeable only when its effects become clear, when the alignment between past and present produces a feeling strong enough to be remembered. At that point, the sequence appears to reverse. The feeling is remembered first, followed by the event that seems to confirm it. This reversal creates the impression that the mind had access to something beyond the present. But in reality, the process remained within the present at all times, drawing on the past to shape how what is happening now is understood. The sense of knowing before something happens, then, may not be a departure from ordinary perception. It may be one of the clearest moments in which the role of memory becomes visible, not as a store of completed events, but as an active force that continuously guides how each new moment is experienced, even when its influence cannot be clearly traced. Before a thought takes shape, the body has often already begun to respond. This is easy to overlook because the changes are small and do not always demand attention. The pace of breathing may shift slightly. Muscles may tighten or relax in a way that is barely noticeable. The rhythm of the heart may adjust, not dramatically, but enough to alter the overall tone of the moment. These changes do not arrive as decisions. They are not guided by clear reasoning. They occur as part of the same continuous process through which the brain interprets what is happening, drawing on patterns that have been learned over time. Because of this, the first sign that something is about to happen is often not a thought, but a feeling that emerges through the body. This feeling can be difficult to describe because it does not present itself as a complete idea. It may appear as a sense of tension, or as a quiet alertness, or as a subtle shift in comfort. It does not explain what is about to occur. It only signals that the current situation is beginning to move in a direction that is different from what was expected. The mind may not yet have identified the reason for this change, but the body has already begun to register it. This is one reason the experience can feel as if it comes before understanding. The body responds first, and the explanation follows later, if it appears at all. This sequence does not require anything unusual. It reflects how perception is organized, where different parts of the system operate at different speeds and with different levels of detail. Some processes remain close to awareness and can be described easily. Others operate more quickly, integrating many small signals at once, and influence the body before they are translated into language. In earlier human environments, this kind of early bodily adjustment may have been closely tied to how situations were navigated. Changes in surroundings were not always clear or immediate. They could begin as small variations that only gradually became more defined. Under such conditions, waiting for a fully formed understanding before responding might have been less effective than allowing the body to adjust as soon as a shift was detected. The body does not need to know exactly what is happening in order to begin preparing for change. It only needs enough information to recognize that the situation is no longer stable in the same way. Over time, this may have supported a system in which bodily responses play an important role in shaping how events are experienced, especially in their early stages. When this system is active, the sense that something is about to happen may arise as a physical state rather than a clear thought. The body becomes slightly more prepared, slightly more attentive, even if the mind cannot yet explain why. This preparedness does not always lead to action. It may remain subtle, influencing posture, attention, and sensitivity to further changes without becoming visible from the outside. But it can still be felt, and it can still shape how the situation is perceived as it unfolds. This helps explain why the feeling of knowing before something happens often has a physical quality. It is not only a matter of thought, it is also a matter of how the body has begun to adjust to what the brain has already detected at a deeper level. Because this adjustment occurs without clear language, it can seem disconnected from reasoning. A person may feel that something is about to change, but cannot say what or why. The body has moved ahead of the explanation, and when the outcome later becomes clear, the earlier feeling may appear meaningful, as if it had anticipated what was to come. But the process itself did not involve a clear act of prediction. It was part of a continuous interaction between perception and the body, where the earliest signals of change are registered not as thoughts, but as subtle shifts in how the body prepares for what might happen next. These early bodily shifts do not happen in isolation. They are closely tied to how the brain organizes signals from both the outside world and the internal state of the body itself. At any given moment, the brain is receiving information not only from sight and sound, but also from subtle changes within the body, such as breathing, muscle tension, and internal rhythms. These internal signals are often quiet and do not reach conscious awareness, yet they contribute to how the present moment is felt. When the brain detects a pattern that suggests a change may be beginning, this detection can influence the body almost immediately. The adjustment may be small, but it can alter the overall tone of experience, creating a sense that something is different even if no clear reason is available. This connection between perception and bodily state helps explain why the feeling of anticipation is often described in physical terms. A person may say that something feels off, or that there is a slight tension without knowing where it comes from. The language used to describe it is often indirect, because the experience itself does not provide a clear image or explanation. It is a state rather than a statement, a condition that shapes how everything else is perceived without defining itself in precise terms. This state can guide attention in subtle ways. It may lead a person to notice certain details more quickly, or to become more aware of changes that might otherwise pass unnoticed. The body, in this sense, is not separate from perception. It is part of how perception unfolds, providing a background that can shift as soon as the brain begins to detect a change in pattern. In earlier human environments, this close connection between perception and bodily state may have been particularly important. Conditions were often uncertain, and changes could develop gradually without clear boundaries. A situation might not present a single, obvious signal that demanded attention. Instead, it could evolve through small variations that only became meaningful when considered together. Under such conditions, a system that allowed the body to adjust early, even before conscious understanding, would help maintain a continuous awareness of change. The body could become slightly more prepared, slightly more attentive, allowing the mind to remain open to what might follow without requiring a clear decision. This early adjustment does not require a specific interpretation of what is happening. The body does not need to identify the exact cause of the change. It only needs to respond to the shift in pattern, preparing for a range of possible outcomes rather than committing to a single one. Because of this, the feeling that emerges is often general rather than specific. It does not point to a precise event. It reflects a change in readiness, a quiet preparation that influences how the next moments will be experienced. When the situation continues and the outcome becomes clearer, the earlier bodily state may seem to have anticipated what was about to happen, but the anticipation was not formed as a clear prediction. It was part of a continuous process in which perception and bodily response are closely linked, each shaping the other as new information appears. This also explains why the experience can sometimes feel stronger in certain situations. When the signals are more consistent or more closely aligned with patterns that have been encountered before, the body's response may become more noticeable. The sense of tension or alertness may stand out more clearly, making the feeling easier to recognize. At other times, when the signals are weaker or less familiar, the bodily adjustment may remain so subtle that it passes without notice. The process itself remains the same, but the visibility of its effects depends on how strongly the pattern is detected. In this way, The sense of knowing before something happens is not only a matter of thought, it is also shaped by how the body responds to patterns that are still forming, creating a state that can be felt even when it cannot yet be explained. When the body shifts before a thought is formed, it does not announce what it is doing. It does not provide a clear signal that can be easily interpreted. Instead, it alters the background of experience in a way that can influence how everything else is perceived. A slight change in breathing, a small increase in tension, or a quiet sense of alertness can shape the way attention moves, even if these changes are not consciously noticed. The mind may continue its usual activity, but something in the overall tone has already shifted. This shift can make certain possibilities feel closer, even if they have not yet been defined. Because the body does not speak in clear statements, the meaning of this shift is often unclear. It does not explain what is about to happen. It only reflects that the situation is no longer being processed in exactly the same way. This can create a sense of uncertainty, but also a subtle form of readiness. The person may not know what to expect, yet may feel that something is beginning to change. This is where the experience of knowing before something happens often takes form. It does not arise as a precise understanding. It emerges as a state that prepares the mind to receive what comes next. In earlier human environments, this kind of preparation may have been closely tied to how situations were navigated over time. Changes in the surroundings were not always sudden or clearly defined. They often developed gradually, through small variations that only became meaningful when combined. Under these conditions, a system that allowed the body to adjust early, even without a clear explanation, would help maintain a continuous awareness of change. The body could respond to the beginning of a shift, allowing attention to remain flexible rather than fixed on what had already been recognized. This flexibility would not depend on certainty. It would depend on the ability to remain open to multiple possibilities, adjusting as new information appeared. The body, in this sense, would act as a guide, not by providing answers, but by shaping how the mind approaches what is still unfolding. When this system is active, the feeling that something is about to happen is not a conclusion, it is a condition. It influences how the next moments are experienced, making certain details more noticeable and others less so. This influence does not need to be strong in order to be effective. Even a slight shift can change how attention is directed, allowing the mind to pick up on further signals that confirm or alter the initial sense. Over time, this creates a feedback loop, where early bodily adjustments guide perception, and new perceptions refine the body's state in return. Because this loop operates continuously, it rarely stands out as something separate. It becomes visible only when the outcome of a situation aligns with the earlier feeling, making the sequence appear more deliberate than it actually was. The person remembers the feeling first, and then the event that followed, creating the impression that the body had anticipated what was to come. But the anticipation was not a single act. It was the result of a gradual process in which perception and bodily response were already interacting long before the outcome became clear. This also helps explain why the feeling can sometimes be misleading. The body responds to patterns that are still forming, not to completed events. If the pattern changes as it develops, the initial adjustment may no longer match the final outcome. In such cases, the earlier feeling may seem incorrect or unfounded, but this does not mean the process itself was flawed. It reflects the uncertainty inherent in responding early, before all information is available. The body remains open, adjusting as the situation evolves, rather than committing to a fixed interpretation. In this way, the sense of knowing before something happens can be understood as a moment when the body's quiet adjustments become noticeable. It reveals a process that is always present, where perception and physical state are closely linked, and where the earliest signs of change are felt before they are fully understood. When the body begins to shift, the change is often accompanied by a subtle emotional tone. This tone does not appear as a full emotion with a clear label. It is not strong enough to be called fear or confidence, and it does not demand immediate attention. Instead, it exists at the edge of awareness, shaping how the situation feels without clearly explaining why. A moment may feel slightly tense, slightly uncertain, or quietly settled even before any clear reason is available. This early tone is not separate from the process that has already been described. It is another expression of how the mind and body respond together to patterns that are still forming. The brain does not only organize sensory information, it also assigns a kind of value to what it detects, adjusting the overall feeling of the moment in response to subtle changes. This adjustment can happen quickly, often before conscious thought has time to form a clear interpretation. As a result, the first indication that something is about to happen may not be a thought or even a physical sensation alone, but a shift in how the situation feels emotionally. This shift can guide attention in a way that is difficult to describe directly. A person may become slightly more alert or slightly more cautious without knowing exactly why. The emotional tone acts as a signal, not by providing information in a precise form, but by influencing how the mind approaches what is unfolding. It can make certain possibilities feel closer, even if those possibilities have not yet been clearly defined. In this sense, emotion is not only a response to what has already happened, it is also part of how the present is interpreted and how the next moment is anticipated. If we consider how this might have functioned in earlier human environments, the importance of such early emotional shifts becomes more apparent. Conditions were often uncertain, and changes could develop gradually without clear boundaries. A situation might begin to move in a new direction without presenting a single, obvious signal. Under these conditions, an early change in emotional tone could help guide attention before a clear understanding was possible. The body might become slightly more alert, or slightly more cautious, allowing the mind to remain open to further changes without requiring an immediate explanation. This kind of response would not depend on certainty. It would depend on sensitivity to patterns that are still incomplete, where the emotional tone reflects a shift in how the situation is being processed, rather than a final conclusion about what it means. Over time, this may have contributed to a system in which emotion, perception, and bodily state are closely intertwined. The mind does not wait to understand before it begins to feel. It adjusts its emotional tone as soon as it detects a change in pattern, even if that change has not yet been clearly identified. Because of this, the feeling that something is about to happen can often be traced to a subtle emotional shift that appears before any clear thought or explanation. This shift does not predict the future in a precise way. It reflects a change in how the present is being organized, influenced by patterns that have been encountered before. When the outcome later becomes clear, the earlier emotional tone may seem meaningful, as if it had pointed toward what was to come. But the process itself did not involve a clear act of prediction. It was part of a continuous adjustment, where the mind and body respond together to what is beginning to unfold, shaping the experience of the present in a way that can be felt before it can be fully understood. This early emotional tone does not remain fixed. It changes as the situation continues, adjusting in small ways as new information becomes available. At first, the shift may be barely noticeable, a faint sense that something is different. As more signals begin to align, the tone can become clearer, shaping attention more strongly and influencing how each new detail is interpreted. This gradual change is important because it shows that the feeling of anticipation is not a single moment. It is a process that unfolds over time, where the emotional tone evolves alongside the pattern it reflects. The mind does not move directly from uncertainty to certainty. It passes through intermediate states where possibilities are being weighed without being fully defined. During these states, the emotional tone acts as a guide, helping to organize perception even when the situation itself is still unclear. It does not provide answers. It shapes the direction in which attention moves, making some elements more prominent and others less so. This shaping happens quietly, often without drawing attention to itself, yet it influences how the entire moment is experienced. A person may not be able to explain why one possibility feels more likely than another, but the feeling itself can still guide how they interpret what is happening. This becomes especially noticeable in situations where the outcome is not immediately obvious. The mind does not wait for a clear conclusion before it begins to adjust. It starts to lean towards certain possibilities, guided by the emotional tone that reflects how the current pattern compares to past experience. This leaning is not absolute. It remains flexible, ready to shift again as new signals appear. Because of this, the emotional tone often carries a sense of openness rather than finality. It suggests that something is changing, but does not define exactly what that change will be. If we look again at the conditions under which human perception developed, this flexibility becomes easier to understand. Environments were rarely stable, and situations often evolved in ways that could not be predicted with complete accuracy. A system that relied on fixed conclusions would have been less adaptable than one that allowed for continuous adjustment. The emotional tone, in this sense, can be seen as part of a flexible system that remains sensitive to change without committing too early to a single interpretation. It allows the mind to remain prepared while still open, balancing between readiness and uncertainty. Over time, this may have supported a way of experiencing the world in which feeling and perception are closely linked, where the emotional tone reflects the ongoing process of interpretation rather than a final judgment about what is happening. This also helps explain why the feeling of knowing before something happens is often accompanied by a sense of ambiguity. The emotional tone points toward a direction, but it does not define it clearly. It reflects a stage in the process where the pattern is still forming, where the mind is adjusting to possibilities rather than arriving at a conclusion. When the outcome later becomes clear, the earlier tone may seem to have anticipated it, but the anticipation was not precise. It was an expression of a process that was already underway, where perception, memory, and bodily response were combining to shape how the present was understood. Because this process unfolds gradually, the emotional tone can be seen as a kind of bridge between what has already been detected and what has not yet been fully recognized. It carries forward the influence of past experience, while remaining open to change, allowing the mind to move through uncertainty without requiring immediate clarity. Because this emotional tone remains subtle, it is often interpreted only after an outcome has already taken place. A person may look back and recognize that the situation had felt different from the beginning, even if that difference was not clearly understood at the time. This retrospective awareness can give the impression that the feeling contained more information than it actually did. The mind, now able to see the completed sequence, fills in the earlier moment with meaning that was not fully present when the feeling first appeared. This does not mean the feeling was empty or without basis. It means that its content was incomplete, shaped by partial signals that only later became clear. When the outcome is known, those signals can be reinterpreted as if they had pointed directly to it. But in the moment itself, they did not define a single path. They only suggested that a change was beginning to unfold. This difference between the moment of feeling and the later understanding is important. It shows that the sense of knowing before something happens is not a fixed insight that appears fully formed. It is part of a process that becomes clearer over time, as new information allows earlier signals to be reinterpreted. The emotional tone, in this sense, does not predict a specific future. It marks a shift in how the present is being processed, one that may or may not align with what eventually occurs. If we consider how this might have functioned over long periods of human history, the value of such a system becomes more visible. Environments did not always provide clear outcomes in advance. And, quote, situations often developed through stages, where early signals could indicate that something was changing, but not what that change would lead to. Under these conditions, an early emotional shift could help guide attention without requiring a precise conclusion. It could allow the mind to remain alert to further developments, adjusting its interpretation as more information became available. This kind of response would not depend on accuracy in a strict sense. It would depend on flexibility, on the ability to remain open to multiple possibilities while still responding to the direction in which a situation seemed to be moving. Over time, this may have supported a way of experiencing the world in which emotion plays a continuous role in shaping perception. The mind does not wait for clear knowledge before it begins to feel. It adjusts its emotional tone as part of an ongoing process, reflecting changes in pattern that are still incomplete. Because this adjustment happens early, it can appear to come before understanding, creating the impression that the feeling itself contains knowledge of what is about to happen. But the knowledge is not fully formed at that stage. It is distributed across many small signals, each one contributing to a general sense of direction without defining it precisely. This also explains why the experience can sometimes feel convincing even when it is not accurate. The emotional tone reflects the process of alignment, not the final outcome. When that alignment is based on patterns that are only partially similar to what is actually unfolding, the resulting feeling may point in a direction that does not match what eventually happens. In such cases, the earlier sense may seem misleading, but the process itself remains consistent. It is always responding to what is present, even if that presence is incomplete or ambiguous. In this way, the feeling of knowing before something happens can be understood as a moment when the emotional dimension of perception becomes visible. It reveals how the mind continuously adjusts its interpretation of the present, using feeling not as a final answer, but as a guide that helps navigate uncertainty before clarity has been reached. When the feeling arrives without a clear explanation, it is often interpreted in ways that go beyond the process that produced it. Because the mind cannot easily trace where the feeling came from, it begins to assign meaning to it after the fact. The experience is remembered as something that appeared suddenly, without visible cause, and this absence of a clear origin can make it seem as if the feeling came from outside the usual flow of perception. Over time, this can lead to a different kind of understanding, one in which the experience is no longer seen as part of ordinary cognition, but as something separate, something that feels almost independent of the processes that shape everyday thought. This shift in interpretation does not require any dramatic belief. It can happen quietly, simply because the structure of the experience invites it. The feeling appears before the explanation, and the explanation never fully accounts for it. In that gap, the mind looks for other ways to understand what happened. It may describe the experience as intuition, as a sense of knowing without knowing why, or as a form of insight that does not follow the usual path of reasoning. These descriptions are not attempts to exaggerate the experience. They are attempts to make sense of something that does not present itself in a familiar way. The difficulty lies not in the feeling itself, but in how it is later understood. If we return to the underlying process, the feeling does not emerge from a single hidden source. It arises from many small signals that are combined before they reach awareness. Because these signals are not individually noticed, the result appears without visible steps. The mind then tries to reconstruct those steps, but finds no clear sequence to follow. This absence of a visible path makes the experience feel as if it bypassed normal perception, even though it was produced by it. In earlier human environments, such experiences may not have required a separate interpretation. They would have been part of the continuous flow of perception, where early adjustments guided attention without needing to be explained. But in more structured settings, where clear reasoning and explicit knowledge are often emphasized, the lack of explanation can stand out more strongly. The mind expects to understand how it arrived at a conclusion. When that understanding is incomplete, the conclusion itself can feel unusual, even if the process that produced it is ordinary. This is where the experience begins to take on a different quality. It is not just a feeling of anticipation. It becomes something that seems to exist outside the normal boundaries of thought. The person may feel that they have accessed something beyond what is immediately visible, even though the process remained entirely within the present. This interpretation is reinforced by the way the experience is remembered. The earlier feeling is linked directly to the later outcome, creating a clear connection between the two. The intermediate steps, which were never fully visible, remain absent. As a result, the sequence appears simpler than it actually was. The feeling seems to lead directly to the event, without the gradual adjustments that took place in between. This simplification makes the experience more striking, but also more difficult to place within the normal functioning of the mind. In this way, the sense that something is more than ordinary may arise not from the feeling itself, but from the way it is later interpreted. The process remains grounded in perception, memory, and bodily response. But because it unfolds without clear language, it leaves behind an impression that is open to different explanations, some of which move beyond the mechanisms that produced it. When an experience cannot be easily explained, the mind does not leave it unresolved for long. It begins to organize the memory of that experience in a way that feels complete, even if some of the original steps were never fully visible. This process is quiet and often goes unnoticed. The earlier feeling is connected to the later outcome, and the two are arranged into a single coherent sequence. What was once a gradual adjustment becomes a clear moment. What was once a subtle shift becomes a distinct signal. In this reorganization, the gaps that existed in real time are reduced, and the experience begins to take on a more definite shape. This does not mean the memory is incorrect. It means that the memory is being structured in a way that makes sense from the perspective of the present. The mind prefers continuity, and it tends to fill in missing steps in order to create a smooth narrative. As a result, the earlier feeling may appear more precise than it originally was. It may seem as though it pointed directly to the outcome, even if, at the time, it only suggested a general direction. This difference between the original experience and the remembered version can make the feeling seem more remarkable than it was in the moment itself. The mind is not intentionally altering the experience. It is shaping it into a form that can be understood and recalled more easily. If we consider how this might relate to the way humans have long made sense of their experiences, the pattern becomes more familiar. Throughout history, people have often described moments of early awareness in terms that go beyond immediate perception. This is not necessarily because the experience itself was different, but because the lack of a clear explanation invited broader interpretations. When the path from perception to feeling is not visible, it can seem as though the feeling came from somewhere outside the usual process. Over time, such interpretations can become part of how the experience is understood, even if the underlying mechanism remains the same. This does not require a belief in anything unusual. It follows naturally from how the mind organizes incomplete information. When a sequence is not fully observed, it is later reconstructed in a way that emphasizes the parts that can be clearly connected. The feeling and the outcome remain, while the intermediate adjustments fade into the background. The result is a memory that appears more direct than the original process. This directness can make the experience feel as if it involved a form of knowing that was not available through ordinary perception. But if we look more closely, the process itself remains consistent with how perception, memory, and expectation interact in other situations. The difference lies in how visible the steps are, not in the nature of the steps themselves. In earlier human environments, this distinction may not have been as noticeable. Perception and interpretation were closely linked, and there may have been less emphasis on separating the stages of thought. A feeling that guided attention would simply be part of how the situation was experienced, without requiring a detailed explanation of how it arose. But in settings where clear reasoning is expected, the absence of a visible path can make the experience stand out more strongly. The mind notices the gap and attempts to resolve it, often by assigning meaning to the feeling itself. This is where the sense that something is more than ordinary can begin to take shape. The feeling is no longer seen only as part of perception. It is seen as a signal that carries its own meaning, independent of the process that produced it. Yet even in this interpretation, the underlying structure remains the same. The mind is responding to patterns that are still forming, using memory and perception to shape expectation in a way that becomes noticeable only after the outcome has made the sequence easier to understand. Over time, these reconstructed memories can influence how future experiences are understood. When a person recalls moments where a feeling seemed to align with what later occurred, those moments may stand out more clearly than others. The many times when a similar feeling did not lead to a matching outcome may fade into the background, not because they are unimportant, but because they do not form a clear or memorable sequence. This does not require any deliberate selection. It is a natural result of how memory tends to preserve what is coherent and easy to connect. As a result, the experience of knowing before something happens can appear more consistent than it actually is. The mind begins to recognize a pattern in its own recollections, where certain feelings seem to be followed by certain outcomes. This recognition can reinforce the interpretation that the feeling itself carries a special form of knowledge, even though the underlying process remains the same as in other moments that were less clearly remembered. This tendency to give more weight to certain memories than others does not depend on conscious intention. It reflects how the mind organizes information over time, emphasizing sequences that form a clear structure and allowing less defined experiences to fade. When a feeling is followed by an outcome that appears to confirm it, the sequence becomes easy to recall. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The feeling is remembered as the starting point, and the outcome is remembered as the confirmation. The many intermediate steps, which were subtle and distributed, remain less visible. In contrast, when a similar feeling does not lead to a clear outcome, the sequence may not be organized in the same way. It may not stand out as a complete event, and so it may not be remembered with the same clarity. Over time, this difference in how experiences are stored can shape the overall impression of how often the feeling is accurate. The mind does not calculate this impression in a precise way. It forms it gradually, based on what is most easily recalled. This helps explain why the sense of having predicted something can feel more reliable than it actually is. The feeling is not being evaluated against all possible instances. It is being interpreted through a subset of experiences that are more clearly remembered. This does not make the experience false. It means that the way it is understood is influenced by how memory organizes the past. If we consider how this might have developed in earlier human contexts, the emphasis on clear sequences becomes more understandable. Experiences that formed a coherent pattern may have been more useful to remember because they could guide future behavior more effectively. A sequence that connected a subtle signal with a meaningful outcome would be easier to apply in new situations than a series of disconnected impressions. Over time, this could support a memory system that favors clarity and continuity, even if that means simplifying the complexity of the original process. The result is a way of remembering that highlights certain experiences while leaving others less defined. This shaping of memory can influence how the present is interpreted. When a similar feeling arises again, it is not experienced in isolation. It is connected, often implicitly, to previous moments that seem to follow the same pattern. This connection can strengthen the sense that the feeling is meaningful, that it carries information about what is about to happen. But the strength of this impression does not necessarily reflect the accuracy of the process. It reflects how memory has organized the past, emphasizing certain connections while leaving others less visible. In this way, the sense that something is more than ordinary may arise not only from the original feeling, but also from how that feeling is remembered and placed within a broader pattern over time. The experience becomes part of a narrative, one that feels consistent and meaningful, even though the underlying process remains distributed, subtle, and closely tied to the ordinary functioning of perception, memory, and bodily response. Even when the underlying processes are shared, the way they are experienced can vary from one person to another. Some people notice these early shifts more clearly, while others rarely pay attention to them at all. This difference does not necessarily mean that one group has a unique ability that the other lacks. It may reflect how attention is directed, how patterns are noticed, and how internal signals are interpreted. The processes themselves remain present in everyone, but the degree to which they become noticeable can change depending on how the mind is oriented toward them. For some, the subtle changes in feeling, posture, or expectation are more easily recognized. They may become aware of small shifts in tone before a situation becomes clear, or they may be more sensitive to patterns that develop gradually over time. This does not require a deliberate effort. It can emerge from the way attention has been shaped through experience, where certain kinds of variation are more readily noticed than others. For others, the same processes may remain in the background. The adjustments still occur, but they do not stand out as distinct experiences. The person moves through situations without forming a clear impression of having sensed something in advance, even though the same underlying mechanisms are active. This variation can be understood without assuming a fixed difference in ability. It may be influenced by how much attention is given to internal states, how often patterns are reflected upon, and how experiences are interpreted after they occur. A person who tends to reflect on subtle changes may become more aware of them over time, while someone who focuses more on clear, external events may not notice these early adjustments as readily. Both are engaging with the same processes but in different ways. If we consider how this variation might have developed over long periods of human history, it becomes easier to see how different patterns of attention could emerge. People lived in a wide range of environments, each with its own demands and rhythms. Some situations may have required close attention to gradual change, while others may have favored more immediate responses to clear signals. Over time, these differences in experience could shape how attention is distributed, influencing which aspects of perception become more prominent. This does not create entirely separate systems. It creates variation within a shared framework, where the same underlying processes are expressed in different ways. This perspective helps explain why the feeling of knowing before something happens can appear more frequently for some people than for others. The difference may lie not in whether the process is present, but in how visible it becomes. When attention is more attuned to subtle shifts, the resulting feelings may be noticed more often and remembered more clearly. When attention is directed elsewhere, the same shifts may pass without being recognized. This also suggests that the experience is not fixed. It can change over time as attention, interpretation, and memory continue to interact. A person who begins to notice these patterns may find that they appear more often, not because the process itself has changed, but because awareness of it has increased. In this way, the sense of knowing before something happens is not a separate ability that belongs only to a few. It is part of a broader system that is shared, but expressed differently depending on how attention and experience shape what becomes visible within it. Differences in how clearly these early shifts are noticed can also be shaped by the pace and structure of a person's daily environment. When life moves quickly, with many distinct tasks and constant changes in focus, attention is often directed toward what is already clear and immediate. In such conditions, there is less space for subtle variations to stand out. The mind moves from one defined point to another, responding to signals that are strong enough to demand action. The quieter adjustments that occur beneath this level may still take place, but they are less likely to be noticed or remembered. In contrast, when the pace is slower and attention is allowed to remain on a situation for a longer period, smaller changes may become more visible. The mind has more opportunity to register slight differences in tone, timing, or arrangement, and these differences can begin to form a pattern before the situation has fully developed. This does not change the underlying process. It changes the conditions under which the process becomes noticeable. The same early adjustments are present in both cases, but their visibility depends on how attention is distributed across time. This variation can also be influenced by how a person relates to their own internal states. Some people tend to notice small changes in how a moment feels, even when those changes are difficult to describe. Others may focus more on external events, giving less attention to the subtle shifts that occur within the body or in the background of perception. Neither approach is more accurate than the other. They simply highlight different aspects of the same process. When attention includes these internal signals, the feeling of anticipation may become more noticeable. When attention is directed outward, the same signals may remain in the background, shaping perception without becoming a distinct experience. If we look at this from a broader perspective, the variation does not point to a special category of people who can predict what will happen. It points to a range of ways in which the same underlying system can be expressed. The brain continues to compare patterns, integrate past experience, and adjust to what is beginning to unfold, regardless of whether these adjustments are consciously noticed. What changes is how much of this activity reaches awareness, and how it is later interpreted. This also helps explain why the experience can become more prominent over time for some individuals. As attention becomes more sensitive to subtle changes, the early stages of pattern formation may be noticed more often. The person may begin to recognize the feeling as it arises, rather than only after the outcome has become clear. This does not mean the process itself has become stronger or more accurate. It means that its early signals have become more visible within awareness. At the same time, this increased visibility can also make the experience feel more significant. When a person notices these early shifts more frequently, and when some of those shifts appear to align with later outcomes, the impression of having anticipated events can become more pronounced. But this impression still depends on the same processes of perception, memory, and interpretation that have been described earlier. It reflects how those processes are noticed and remembered, rather than a change in their fundamental nature. In this way, the variation between individuals can be understood without dividing people into those who can and those who cannot. The system is shared, but the way it becomes visible differs, shaped by attention, environment, and the way experiences are organized over time. The feeling of knowing before something happens, then, is not a fixed trait that some possess and others lack. It is a reflection of how a continuous process is experienced, one that is always present but not always equally seen. Even when these differences in attention and interpretation are taken into account, the underlying process remains the same across individuals. The mind continues to compare what is happening now with patterns that have been encountered before, quietly adjusting its expectations as new signals appear. This adjustment does not depend on whether a person notices it or not. It unfolds continuously, shaping perception in subtle ways that do not always rise into awareness. What changes is how these adjustments are experienced and later understood. For some people, the early shifts in feeling, attention, or bodily state become noticeable enough to form a distinct impression. For others, the same shifts remain in the background, influencing perception without becoming a clear part of conscious experience. This difference can create the appearance that some people have access to something that others do not, even though the same processes are active in both cases. The variation lies not in the presence of the mechanism, but in its visibility within awareness and the meaning that is assigned to it afterward. When a person begins to notice these early impressions more often, they may start to form connections between different moments, linking similar feelings across time. These connections can create a sense of continuity, where each new experience seems to confirm the previous ones. Over time, this can strengthen the impression that the feeling itself is a reliable guide, that it carries information about what is about to happen. But this impression is shaped by how memory organizes past experiences. Moments that appear to align are more likely to be remembered and connected, while those that do not form a clear sequence may fade. As a result, the pattern that emerges in memory may appear more consistent than the process actually is in real time. This does not mean the experience is inaccurate. It means that its apparent consistency is influenced by how it is recalled and interpreted. If we look again at the broader human context, this variation can be understood as part of how different ways of attending to the world develop over time. In some situations, focusing on subtle shifts may provide an advantage, allowing a person to respond to changes before they become obvious. In other situations, it may be more useful to rely on clear, immediate signals. These different modes of attention can coexist, each shaped by experience, environment, and the demands of daily life. They do not create separate kinds of minds, but they can influence which aspects of perception become more prominent. This helps explain why the experience of knowing before something happens can feel personal, even though it arises from a shared system. Each person brings a different history of patterns, a different distribution of attention, and a different way of organizing memory. These differences shape how the same underlying process is expressed, giving it a unique quality that reflects individual experience without requiring a distinct ability. The feeling may seem to belong to the person in a special way, but it remains grounded in the same continuous interaction between perception, memory, and bodily response. It does not indicate that the mind has reached beyond the present. It reflects how deeply the present is being processed, how many layers of past experience are being brought into alignment with what is now unfolding. In this way, the sense that some people appear to predict what will happen can be understood without separating them into a different category. It is not a matter of having or not having a particular ability. It is a matter of how a shared process becomes visible, how it is noticed, and how it is remembered over time. The mind is always adjusting, always integrating, and always preparing for what seems likely. Whether this preparation is experienced as a clear feeling or remains unnoticed does not change the process itself. It only changes how that process appears from within conscious awareness. The surroundings in which a person lives do more than provide events to react to. They shape what is noticed, how quickly changes are detected, and which patterns become familiar over time. A quiet environment, where changes unfold slowly and attention can remain steady, allows small variations to become more visible. A faster environment, filled with constant signals and interruptions, tends to draw attention toward what is immediate and clearly defined. In both cases, the same underlying processes are at work. The brain continues to compare, to align, and to adjust its expectations. But the conditions of the environment influence which parts of this process become noticeable and which remain in the background. This difference can shape how often a person feels that something is about to happen before it does. When the environment allows attention to remain with a situation long enough, subtle patterns have time to emerge. Small changes in timing, rhythm, or arrangement can be detected and integrated before they become obvious. The mind is able to stay with the unfolding sequence, sensing how it is beginning to move rather than waiting for it to reach a clear outcome. In such conditions, the feeling of anticipation may arise more often, not because the process itself is stronger, but because it has more opportunity to be noticed. The person is present with the gradual formation of the pattern, and the early adjustments of perception become part of conscious experience. In contrast, when the environment is more fragmented, attention is frequently redirected. Each moment may be treated as a separate event, with less continuity between what has just happened and what is about to happen. Under these conditions, the early stages of pattern formation may be less visible. The brain still detects them, but the shifts occur beneath the surface, without becoming a distinct experience. The person moves from one clear signal to the next, responding to what is already defined rather than to what is still emerging. This does not remove the process. It changes how it appears. If we consider how this might relate to earlier human settings, the connection becomes clearer. Life did not unfold in isolated moments. It was continuous, shaped by sequences that developed over time. The ability to remain with a situation, to observe gradual change, may have allowed patterns to be recognized at an earlier stage. This does not require a specific claim about how people lived in any particular place. It suggests that in conditions where attention could remain steady, the mind would naturally become more attuned to slow transitions. Over time, this could support a way of perceiving that is sensitive to the beginning of change rather than only to its completion. This sensitivity does not produce exact knowledge. It produces a sense of direction, a quiet alignment with what is starting to form. When this alignment becomes noticeable, it can feel as if something has been known in advance, but the process remains grounded in the present, shaped by how the environment allows patterns to be observed. This also helps explain why the same person may experience this feeling differently in different contexts. In a setting that encourages continuous attention, the early stages of change may be more visible. In a setting that requires constant shifts in focus, those stages may pass without being noticed. The process adapts to the conditions, but it does not disappear. It continues quietly, integrating past and present, whether or not it becomes part of conscious awareness. In this way, the environment does not create the ability to sense what is about to happen. It shapes the visibility of a process that is already there, influencing how often it is noticed and how clearly it is experienced. The way time is experienced within an environment also shapes how patterns are noticed. When moments are closely connected, forming a continuous flow, it becomes easier for the mind to follow gradual change. Each small variation can be related to what came just before it, allowing a sequence to be understood as it unfolds. In this kind of setting, the present is not isolated. It is part of a larger movement where the beginning of a change can be sensed before it becomes fully visible. The mind is able to remain with the process, observing how one state shifts into another, and this continuity allows early adjustments to become more noticeable. In contrast, when time is experienced as a series of separate moments, each with its own distinct focus, the connection between them can become less clear. Attention moves quickly from one point to another, and the gradual transitions that link these points may not stand out. The brain still processes these transitions, but they are less likely to be experienced as a single, unfolding pattern. Instead, each moment appears more self-contained, and the early stages of change may remain hidden beneath the surface. This difference does not alter the underlying mechanism. It changes how the mechanism is expressed within awareness. The sense of anticipation depends not only on what is detected, but on how the flow of time allows that detection to be integrated. If we consider how this might relate to earlier human conditions, the importance of continuity becomes more apparent. Daily life was often structured around extended periods of observation and movement within the same setting. Changes in light, sound, and activity would unfold gradually, providing a continuous stream of information that could be followed over time. Under such conditions, the mind would have more opportunity to track the development of patterns, noticing small shifts as part of an ongoing sequence. This does not require certainty about how specific situations were experienced. It suggests that in contexts where time is experienced as continuous, the early stages of change are more likely to be integrated into perception. The mind does not need to reconstruct the sequence after the fact. It remains within it, adjusting as each new element appears. In this state, the feeling that something is about to happen can arise naturally, not as a sudden insight, but as part of the ongoing perception of change. The person is not stepping outside the present. They are moving within it, following a pattern that is still forming. This also helps explain why the same environment can feel different depending on how time is experienced. When attention is steady and moments are linked, the unfolding of events becomes more visible. When attention is divided and moments are separated, the same unfolding may be less apparent. The process of detection continues, but its expression changes. The sense of anticipation may become less distinct, not because the mind has stopped adjusting, but because the continuity needed to make those adjustments visible is reduced. Over time, this difference in how time is experienced can shape how a person relates to the feeling of knowing before something happens. In settings where continuity is present, the feeling may appear more often and with greater clarity. In settings where time is fragmented, it may be less noticeable, even though the same processes are at work. In this way, the environment influences not only what is perceived, but how perception is organized across time, shaping the conditions under which early patterns become part of conscious experience. When the environment allows patterns to be followed over time, the mind does not need to separate each moment into a distinct event. It can remain within a continuous process, where the present is always connected to what has just occurred and to what is beginning to take shape. In this state, perception becomes less about identifying fixed points and more about tracking movement, about sensing how a situation is shifting even when that shift is still incomplete. The mind does not wait for a clear boundary between one state and another. It responds to the transition itself, adjusting gradually as the pattern develops. This way of perceiving does not produce sharp conclusions. It produces a sense of direction, a quiet alignment with what seems to be forming. When this alignment becomes noticeable, it can feel as if something has been known before it fully appears. But the process itself remains grounded in the present, shaped by how the environment allows changes to be observed as they unfold. This also helps explain why certain environments can make the feeling of anticipation seem more reliable. When patterns are allowed to develop slowly and consistently, the early stages of change may align more often with the final outcome. The mind has more opportunity to detect the direction of the pattern before it becomes clear, and this can create the impression that the initial feeling was accurate. In contrast, in environments where changes occur abruptly or without continuity, early signals may not provide the same guidance. The pattern may shift too quickly or too unpredictably for early adjustments to remain aligned with the outcome. In such cases, the feeling of anticipation may appear less consistent, not because the process is absent, but because the conditions do not support its visibility in the same way. If we consider how this relates to the broader human experience, it becomes clear that the sense of knowing before something happens is not fixed. It is shaped by how the environment structures attention, how time is experienced, and how patterns are allowed to unfold. The mind is always engaged in the same underlying activity, integrating past and present, adjusting to what is emerging. But the clarity of this activity depends on the conditions in which it takes place. This means that the experience is not something that belongs to a particular group of people. It is part of a shared system that becomes more or less visible depending on how perception is organized. When the environment supports continuity and sustained attention, the early stages of pattern formation can become part of conscious awareness. When it does not, those stages remain in the background, influencing perception without becoming a distinct experience. This perspective also brings the focus back to the present moment. The feeling of anticipation does not require access to anything beyond what is already there. It depends on how deeply the present is being processed, how many layers of pattern and memory are being integrated at once. The environment shapes this integration, not by changing the process itself, but by influencing how it is expressed within awareness. In this way, the sense that something is about to happen can be understood as a reflection of how perception moves through time, guided by patterns that are already forming, even when those patterns have not yet reached a point where they can be clearly seen or described. With repeated experience, patterns do not need to be fully reconstructed each time they appear. The mind becomes more efficient, not by remembering every detail, but by recognizing familiar structures more quickly. What once required careful attention can later be sensed with only a few elements in place. A sequence that has been encountered many times may begin to take shape as soon as its early stages appear, allowing the brain to adjust before the full pattern is visible. This does not involve a deliberate act of recall. It reflects a gradual change in how perception is organized, where repetition reduces the need for explicit analysis and allows recognition to occur earlier in the process. Over time, this can create the impression that the mind is moving ahead of events, when in fact, it is responding to patterns that have become easier to detect through familiarity. This effect can be observed in simple situations. When a person hears a familiar sound pattern, they may anticipate the next element before it occurs. When observing a repeated sequence of actions, the mind begins to align with the expected outcome before all the steps have unfolded. These responses do not require conscious reasoning. They emerge from the way repeated exposure shapes the structure of perception, making certain patterns more readily available and easier to recognize at an earlier stage. As repetition increases, the threshold for recognition decreases. Fewer signals are needed for the brain to begin adjusting, and the resulting sense of anticipation may appear sooner, sometimes before the person is aware of the pattern itself. If we consider how this might relate to earlier human conditions, the role of repetition becomes even more significant. Daily life often involved recurring situations, where similar sequences unfolded across different contexts. The ability to recognize these sequences early could support smoother interaction with the environment, allowing adjustments to be made before the situation reached a point that required immediate response. This does not require precise prediction. It involves a gradual alignment with patterns that have been encountered before, where familiarity allows the mind to move more quickly through the early stages of recognition. Over time, this alignment may become so efficient that it is no longer experienced as a step-by-step process. It appears as a single moment, where the mind seems to know what is about to happen without clearly identifying how that knowledge was formed. This also helps explain why the feeling of knowing before something happens can become stronger in situations that are familiar. The more often a pattern has been encountered, the more easily it can be recognized from partial information. The mind does not need to wait for all elements to appear. It begins to align as soon as enough similarity is detected, even if that similarity is incomplete. Because this alignment happens quickly and without conscious effort, it can feel as if the mind has reached a conclusion in advance. But the process remains grounded in repetition, in the gradual shaping of perception through experience. This does not mean the mind becomes more accurate in a strict sense. It becomes more responsive to certain patterns, more ready to detect them early. When the situation follows a familiar path, this responsiveness can create a strong sense of anticipation. When the situation differs in important ways, the same responsiveness may lead to expectations that do not match the outcome. In this way, repetition increases sensitivity, but it does not remove uncertainty. The feeling that results reflects the balance between familiarity and variation, where the mind moves ahead based on what it has encountered before, even as the present continues to unfold in ways that may not be fully predictable. As repetition continues, the way patterns are recognized begins to change in a subtle but important way. The mind no longer needs to reconstruct the sequence from the beginning each time. Instead, it begins to rely on partial cues, using small fragments to activate a broader structure that has been encountered before. This allows recognition to occur earlier, often before the pattern is fully visible. A few elements are enough to suggest a direction, and the brain begins to align with that direction without waiting for confirmation. This process does not require a complete match. It depends on similarity, on the way certain features resemble those of past experiences, even if the overall situation is not identical. Because of this, the feeling of anticipation can arise from incomplete information. The mind is not identifying a finished pattern. It is responding to the beginning of one, using fragments to guide its expectations. This shift from full reconstruction to partial activation is one of the reasons the experience can feel immediate. There is no clear sequence of steps that can be followed. The pattern appears to be recognized all at once, even though it is based on many smaller comparisons that have taken place beneath awareness. The more often a pattern has been encountered, the more easily it can be activated in this way. The threshold for recognition becomes lower, and the mind begins to respond with less information. This can create a sense that the outcome is already known, even though the situation is still unfolding. If we consider how this might function in broader human contexts, the role of partial cues becomes more understandable. Situations rarely repeat in exact form. They share elements, but those elements are arranged differently each time. A system that required complete similarity would be limited in its ability to respond. A system that can work with fragments, on the other hand, can begin adjusting earlier, using whatever information is available. Over time, this may support a form of perception that is highly responsive to the beginnings of patterns, where the mind is prepared to move in a certain direction before the full structure is present. This responsiveness does not produce certainty. It produces a sense of likelihood, a leaning toward outcomes that resemble those encountered before. Because this leaning occurs quickly, It can be experienced as a kind of knowing that appears before reasoning has had time to form. But the process itself remains grounded in comparison and similarity, not in access to future events. It is the present, interpreted through fragments of the past, that creates the impression of anticipation. This also helps explain why the experience can sometimes be misleading. When the fragments that trigger recognition are similar but not sufficiently aligned with the actual pattern, the resulting expectation may not match what eventually happens. The mind responds early, but it responds to a resemblance that may not fully hold as the situation develops. In such cases, the feeling of knowing before something happens may point in a direction that turns out to be incomplete or incorrect. This does not indicate a failure of the process. It reflects the limits of working with partial information, where early alignment is based on similarity rather than certainty. Over time, the mind continues to adjust, refining its expectations as new information appears. But the initial impression remains part of the experience, contributing to the sense that something was anticipated before it was fully understood. In this way, repetition and familiarity allow the mind to move earlier into the unfolding of events, creating a feeling that can seem immediate and direct, even though it arises from a gradual process of comparison and adjustment that remains largely hidden from conscious awareness. As this reliance on partial cues becomes more established, the boundary between perception and expectation becomes even less distinct. The mind does not wait for a pattern to be fully formed before it begins to interpret what is happening. It moves within the pattern as it develops, adjusting its sense of direction with each small piece of information that appears. This movement can feel immediate because the steps that lead to it are not clearly visible. The brain is comparing, matching, and aligning continuously. But these operations remain distributed across many small processes that do not present themselves as a sequence that can be followed. What reaches awareness is the result, a sense that something is taking shape in a particular way, even before that shape has become clear. When repetition has strengthened certain patterns, this result can appear with very little input. A few familiar elements are enough to set the process in motion, and the mind begins to lean toward what it has learned to expect. This leaning does not take the form of a fixed conclusion. It remains flexible, open to revision as new information appears. But it can still feel strong, especially when the fragments that triggered it closely resemble patterns that have been encountered many times before. In these moments, the feeling of knowing before something happens can be particularly noticeable. It appears quickly, without the visible effort of reasoning, and it can give the impression that the mind has moved ahead of the present. Yet the process itself has not left the present. It is working within it, responding to early signals that have been shaped by repetition into recognizable forms. If we consider how this might have functioned in earlier human contexts, the value of such responsiveness becomes more apparent. Situations did not always allow for extended analysis. Patterns needed to be recognized as they began, not only after they had fully developed. A system that could respond to fragments, using them to guide attention and readiness, would allow the mind to remain aligned with what was unfolding, even when information was incomplete. Over time, this could support a form of perception that is continuously moving forward, not in the sense of predicting exact outcomes, but in the sense of staying closely connected to the direction in which events are developing. This connection is what gives rise to the feeling of anticipation. It is not a separate ability that appears in certain moments. It is an expression of how perception operates when it is shaped by repetition, familiarity, and the need to respond to patterns as they emerge. The mind is always integrating past and present, always adjusting its expectations, even when those adjustments are not clearly noticed. The feeling that something is about to happen becomes visible when this adjustment reaches a point where it can be felt, even if it cannot yet be explained. This also highlights the limits of the experience. Because it is based on partial information and similarity, it does not provide certainty. It offers a direction, a possibility that may or may not continue as the situation unfolds. When the alignment between past patterns and present signals is strong, the feeling may seem accurate. When it is weaker or incomplete, the same process may lead to an expectation that does not match the outcome. In both cases, the underlying mechanism remains the same. It reflects a system that is designed to respond early, to adjust continuously, and to remain open to revision as new information appears. In this way, The sense of knowing before something happens can be understood as the surface of a deeper process, one that has been shaped by repetition over long periods of time, allowing the mind to move through the unfolding of events with a readiness that is felt before it is fully understood. At any given moment, the mind is not waiting for the world to present itself in complete form. It is already forming an expectation about what the next moment will be like, even before that moment arrives. This expectation is not something that appears only in certain situations. It is continuous, shaping how perception unfolds from one moment to the next. Each experience is guided by what has just occurred, by patterns that have been encountered before, and by the way the brain has learned to move through sequences over time. Because of this, the present is never experienced in isolation. It is always connected to what came before and to what is about to follow, even if that connection is not consciously noticed. This means that the mind is always, in a quiet sense, anticipating, not predicting in a precise or deliberate way, but preparing, adjusting, and aligning with what seems likely based on the information available at the time. This preparation is so constant that it rarely stands out. It becomes noticeable only in moments where its effect is clear, where the alignment between expectation and outcome is strong enough to be remembered. In most cases, it remains invisible, blending into the normal flow of experience. When a person feels that something is about to happen, they are encountering this process more directly. The adjustment that is usually hidden becomes visible as a feeling, a shift that can be noticed before it can be explained. But the process itself is not new. It has been present all along, guiding perception in ways that do not require conscious awareness. If we consider how this might have developed over long periods of human history, the continuity of this process becomes easier to understand. Environments did not present isolated events that could be analyzed independently. They unfolded in sequences, where each moment was connected to the next. The ability to move through these sequences smoothly would depend on the mind's capacity to anticipate how they might continue. This anticipation would not need to be exact. It would only need to provide a sense of direction, allowing perception and action to remain aligned with what was unfolding. Over time, this could support a system in which anticipation is not a special function, but a fundamental aspect of how perception operates. The mind does not switch between sensing and predicting. It integrates the two, allowing each moment to be shaped by what is expected, as well as by what is observed. This integration helps explain why the feeling of knowing before something happens can seem unusual, even though it arises from a process that is always active. The feeling stands out because it makes the process visible, because it brings into awareness something that is usually distributed and unnoticed. It gives the impression that the mind has done something different, when in fact it has only revealed a part of its normal operation. This also suggests that the experience is not limited to certain kinds of situations. It can occur wherever patterns are forming, wherever the present carries hints of what might follow. The difference lies in whether those hints become noticeable. When they do, the underlying process becomes apparent as a feeling. When they do not, the process continues quietly, shaping perception without drawing attention to itself. In this way, the sense of knowing before something happens is not an exception to how the mind works. It is a moment in which the continuous nature of anticipation becomes visible, allowing the person to feel, however briefly, how the present is always being shaped by what is expected to come next. Because this continuous anticipation is always present, it rarely appears as something separate from perception. It is woven into the way each moment is experienced, shaping what feels familiar and what feels unexpected. When the mind's expectations align closely with what unfolds, the experience feels smooth, almost effortless. There is little need to question what is happening, because the flow of events matches what has already been prepared. In these cases, the process of anticipation remains invisible. It has done its work quietly, allowing perception to move forward without interruption. It is only when there is a noticeable difference, when the unfolding moment diverges from what was expected, that the underlying process begins to stand out. The mind becomes more active, adjusting its expectations and drawing attention to what has changed. This adjustment can sometimes be felt as a moment of surprise, but it can also appear earlier, as a subtle shift before the difference becomes clear. In that earlier stage, the mind has already begun to detect that something is not aligning in the usual way. The signals are still incomplete, but they are enough to alter the sense of what is likely to happen next. This alteration may not be recognized as a specific observation. It may appear as a quiet feeling, a slight change in how the situation is held in awareness. This is where the sense of anticipation becomes noticeable, not because the mind has moved beyond the present, but because the difference between expectation and unfolding reality has reached a point where it can be felt. If we consider how this might have functioned in broader human contexts, the importance of this constant adjustment becomes clearer. Environments were not always predictable, and the ability to respond to change depended on noticing when patterns began to diverge. The mind did not need to wait for a clear outcome. It needed to remain sensitive to the early stages of change, allowing it to adjust before the situation became fully defined. This sensitivity would not operate as a separate function. It would be part of the same continuous process that shapes perception, where anticipation and observation are integrated at every moment. Over time, this could support a way of experiencing the world in which the present is always being evaluated in relation to what is expected, even when that evaluation is not consciously noticed. This also helps explain why the feeling of knowing before something happens is often linked to moments of change rather than moments of stability. When a situation is stable and unfolds as expected, the process of anticipation remains hidden. There is no need for it to become visible, because there is no difference to draw attention to it. But when a change begins, especially one that is subtle and still forming, the adjustment in expectation can become noticeable. The mind senses that something is shifting, even if it cannot yet define what that shift will lead to. This sense does not provide a clear answer. It reflects the beginning of a difference, a divergence between what was expected and what is starting to occur. Because this divergence is still incomplete, the feeling remains open without a precise conclusion. It points toward a change without defining it. When the outcome later becomes clear, the earlier feeling may appear meaningful, as if it had anticipated what would happen. But the process itself did not involve a distinct act of prediction. It was part of the continuous adjustment of perception, where the mind is always aligning with what is likely, and always ready to revise that alignment as new information appears. In this way, the sense of knowing before something happens can be understood as a moment when the ongoing process of anticipation becomes visible, revealing how each moment is shaped not only by what is present, but by how it compares to what the mind has come to expect. When this continuous adjustment is viewed across many moments, it becomes clear that the mind is not moving from one finished state to another. It is always in transition, always balancing between what has already been experienced and what is beginning to take shape. Each moment carries traces of what came before and hints of what may follow, and perception unfolds within this overlap. Because of this, anticipation is not something that begins at a specific point. It is already present, guiding how the present is organized even before it is noticed. Most of the time, this guidance remains quiet. It shapes the flow of experience without drawing attention to itself, allowing the mind to move smoothly through familiar patterns. It is only when this guidance becomes noticeable, when it rises into awareness as a feeling, that it appears to stand apart from the rest of perception. In these moments, the person becomes aware of something that is usually hidden, a sense that the present is already leaning toward a particular direction. This sense does not come with a clear explanation, because it is not the result of a single, identifiable step. It is the surface of a process that has been unfolding continuously, integrating past experience, current signals, and emerging patterns into a single, evolving state. When this state becomes visible, it can feel as though the mind has stepped outside of ordinary perception, but in reality, it has only revealed what was already taking place beneath awareness. If we consider how this relates to the broader human experience, the idea that some moments feel more meaningful than others becomes easier to understand. Not all situations produce a noticeable sense of anticipation. Many unfold in ways that align closely with what is expected, leaving the underlying process hidden. But when a situation begins to shift in a way that is both subtle and significant, the adjustment in expectation may become more apparent. The mind senses that something is changing, even if it cannot yet define that change. This awareness is not separate from the ongoing process of perception. It is a moment in which that process becomes visible, allowing the person to experience directly how the present is connected to what is about to follow. This also explains why the feeling often fades once the outcome becomes clear. When the pattern has fully formed, there is no longer a need for early adjustment. The mind can now respond to what is clearly present, and the subtle process that guided it beforehand returns to the background. The earlier sense of anticipation remains only as a memory, now connected to the outcome in a way that can make it seem more precise than it originally was. Over time, these remembered moments can shape how the experience is understood, reinforcing the impression that the mind can know what is about to happen. But the process itself does not change. It continues to operate in the same way, quietly integrating information and adjusting expectations at every moment. In this way, the sense of knowing before something happens can be seen as a brief glimpse into a continuous activity. It reveals how the mind is always working ahead of itself, not by reaching into the future, but by responding to the present with a depth that is not always visible. The feeling does not come from outside the ordinary functioning of the mind. It comes from within it, from the constant interaction between memory, perception, and expectation that shapes each moment as it unfolds. When this interaction becomes noticeable, it can feel unusual, even striking, but it remains part of the same process that is always at work, guiding how the present is experienced and how the next moment is approached. When all of these elements are brought together, the experience begins to settle into a different kind of understanding. The feeling of knowing before something happens no longer needs to be placed outside the ordinary workings of the mind. It can be seen as part of a continuous process, one that has been present in every moment, quietly shaping how the present is interpreted and how the next moment is approached. The mind does not step forward into the future. It remains within the present, but it engages with that present in a way that is already oriented toward what is beginning to form. This orientation is not a single act. It is the result of many processes working together, memory providing patterns, perception detecting small changes, the body adjusting its state, and emotional tone guiding attention. None of these elements operate in isolation, and none of them require conscious awareness in order to influence how a moment is experienced. When their combined effect becomes noticeable, it can feel as though something unusual has occurred. But what is being revealed is not an exception. It is the structure of perception itself, briefly made visible. This does not remove the sense of wonder that can accompany the experience. It changes where that wonder is placed. Instead of asking how the mind could access something that has not yet happened, the question becomes how the mind can respond so deeply to what is already unfolding. The present moment is not empty. It contains layers of pattern, traces of past experience, and early signs of change that are not immediately obvious. The mind moves within these layers continuously, aligning with what seems most likely even when that likelihood cannot be clearly described. The feeling that something is about to happen is one way this alignment becomes visible. It is not a statement about the future. It is a reflection of how the present is being processed. If we return to the broader human context, this understanding fits within the same pattern that has been seen throughout. Perception did not develop as a system that waits for certainty. It developed as a system that remains sensitive to change, capable of adjusting before a situation becomes fully defined. This sensitivity is not perfect. It does not provide exact knowledge, and it does not guarantee accuracy. It provides direction, a way of staying connected to what is emerging even when that emergence is incomplete. Over time, this has shaped a mind that is always in motion, always integrating, always preparing, even when it appears to be still. The experience of knowing before something happens, then, can be understood as a moment in which this ongoing motion becomes perceptible. It reveals how the mind is constantly balancing between past and present, using what has been learned to shape what is being experienced now. The future, in this sense, is not something that is accessed directly. It is something that is approached gradually, through the way the present is interpreted. Each moment carries within it a range of possibilities, and the mind moves within that range, adjusting as those possibilities begin to narrow. The feeling that arises is not a fixed answer. It is a sign of this movement, a trace of the process by which the mind aligns itself with what is taking shape. And because this alignment is always happening, even when it is not noticed, the experience is not limited to rare or special moments. It is part of the continuous flow of perception, visible only when the conditions allow it to stand out against the background of ordinary awareness. As this understanding settles more fully, the experience begins to lose the need for a sharp boundary between what is ordinary and what feels unusual. The sense of knowing before something happens does not need to be separated from everyday perception. It can be seen as a moment in which the usual movement of the mind becomes easier to notice. What once appeared as a sudden, unexplained insight now appears as the surface of a deeper continuity, one that connects each moment to the next without interruption. The mind is not moving from stillness into action. It is already in motion, already shaping the present through what it has learned and what it is beginning to detect. The feeling simply reveals that motion, briefly and without explanation. This does not reduce the experience. It places it within a wider structure, where its meaning comes not from being rare, but from being part of something constant and often unseen. When a person reflects on these moments, it can become clear that the feeling itself was never separate from the situation. It arose from within it, shaped by the same elements that were already present but not yet fully visible. The small changes in timing, the subtle variations in expression, the faint shifts in arrangement were already there, forming a pattern that had begun to take shape. The mind did not reach beyond these elements. It responded to them in a way that gathered their direction before their form was complete. Because this gathering happened without clear language, it could not be easily traced. It appeared as a single moment, even though it was the result of many small adjustments unfolding together. This is why the experience often feels immediate. It compresses a process that is extended in time into a point that can be felt but not easily explained. The explanation, when it comes, arrives later, shaped by the outcome. And by the way, memory organizes the sequence. If we remain with the present moment, rather than with the memory of it, the process becomes quieter and more continuous. There is no clear beginning and no clear end. There is only a gradual alignment, where the mind moves with the unfolding of events, adjusting as each new element appears. This alignment does not require certainty. It does not seek a final answer. It remains open, allowing perception to stay connected to what is changing rather than to what has already been defined. In this openness, the feeling of anticipation is no longer a mystery to be solved. It becomes a natural expression of how the mind stays in relation to what is not yet fully known. If we look at the broader implications of this, the question of prediction begins to change its meaning. The mind is not attempting to determine a fixed future. It is navigating a field of possibilities, narrowing them gradually as more information becomes available. Each moment carries forward the influence of what has come before, and each adjustment brings the present into closer alignment with what is likely to follow. This process does not produce certainty, but it provides continuity. It allows the mind to remain engaged with the unfolding of events without needing to separate itself from them. The feeling that arises within this process is not a final statement. It is a sign that the alignment is already underway. This perspective also brings attention back to the quiet nature of the experience. It is not dramatic, and it does not demand recognition. It appears briefly, often at the edge of awareness, and then fades as the situation continues. Its value does not lie in its intensity, but in what it reveals about the structure of perception. It shows that the mind is always working with more than what is immediately visible, always integrating layers of information that do not fully enter awareness. When these layers become noticeable, the result can feel unusual, but the process itself remains entirely within the ordinary functioning of the mind. Over time, this understanding can shift how the experience is held. Instead of being seen as something separate or special, it can be recognized as part of a continuous flow, one that connects past, present, and what is beginning to emerge. The sense of knowing before something happens becomes less about reaching forward and more about being closely aligned with what is already in motion. It is not an ability that appears in isolation. It is a reflection of how perception itself unfolds, quietly and without interruption, across each moment. And as this becomes clearer, the experience no longer needs to be explained in terms that go beyond the present. It can remain where it belongs, within the ongoing movement of the mind, where each moment carries within it the traces of what has been and the beginnings of what is yet to come, not as a fixed outcome, but as a direction that is always forming and reforming as the mind continues to move through time. At the end of this long movement, through perception, memory, and quiet adjustment, the question returns in a different form. It is no longer about whether some humans can truly predict what has not yet happened. It becomes a question about what it means to experience the present so deeply that it begins to suggest what might come next. The feeling that once seemed to point forward into the future now appears to rest within the present itself, shaped by patterns that are already forming, even if they have not yet reached a clear expression. What seemed like an ability becomes a condition, a way of being in relation to unfolding events rather than a power that stands apart from them. This shift does not remove the sense of wonder. It changes its direction. The mind is not stepping outside of time. It is moving within it, continuously aligning with what is beginning to take shape. The subtle feeling that something is about to happen is not a message from elsewhere. It is a trace of this alignment, a quiet indication that the present is already in motion, already carrying within it the beginnings of what may follow. This understanding does not provide certainty, and it does not attempt to. The process it describes remains open, shaped by incomplete signals and guided by patterns that are never perfectly repeated. The mind does not arrive at fixed answers. It moves through possibilities, adjusting as those possibilities narrow and shift. The feeling that arises from this movement is not a conclusion. It is a sign that the movement is already underway. If we return once more to the broader human context, the continuity of this process becomes even more apparent. Over long stretches of time, perception has been shaped not by isolated events, but by sequences, by gradual changes that required sensitivity rather than certainty. The ability to remain attuned to these changes may not have been experienced as something remarkable. It may have been part of the ordinary way in which the world was encountered, where the present was always connected to what had just occurred and to what was beginning to emerge. In this light, the feeling of knowing before something happens is not an interruption of normal perception. It is a moment in which that perception reveals its depth. It shows that the present is not as simple as it first appears. It is layered, dynamic, and always in transition. The mind moves through these layers without needing to make them explicit, responding to what is already there in ways that do not require clear explanation. When this response becomes noticeable, it can feel as though something has been known in advance. But what has been known is not the future itself. It is the direction of the present, the way it is beginning to unfold before it becomes fully visible. This brings the question back to a quieter place. The experience does not ask for belief in something beyond the ordinary. It asks for attention to what is already happening, to the way each moment carries within it the traces of what has been and the beginnings of what is forming. The mind does not need to reach forward. It only needs to remain connected to this unfolding, to allow perception to follow the subtle movement of change as it develops. In doing so, the feeling that once seemed mysterious becomes part of a continuous flow, one that does not separate knowing from experiencing, but brings them together in a way that is gentle, gradual, and often unnoticed. And perhaps, when the mind becomes quiet enough to observe this process without trying to fix it into a clear answer, the original question remains, but in a softer form, no longer asking how the future can be known, but wondering instead how much of it is already present, waiting to be quietly recognized within the moment before it fully appears.